Check 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. This is a sound check for captions. Sound check for closed captioning. 1, 2, 3. University of North Georgia Symposium on Leadership in a Complex World, November 14th through 15th, 2018. Test 1, 2, 3.
We can wait 5 more minutes. I mean, we can wait. We can wait till 9.
Give her a ride.
We can wait till 9. Decision point will be 8:59 or 8:59.
Do you want to?
So Sean McFate. So Billy's supposed to introduce him, but I've got his bio. All right, good morning and welcome back to our PMSC Symposium Day 2. A note from yesterday, we didn't tell you about this, but Dr. Bertha Anders was supposed to be here and speak yesterday. And she had a death in the family, and she was from Harvard. She had a death in the family and had to fly to Germany to do funeral arrangements, and so that's why she was not here yesterday. I want to thank everybody who participated in yesterday's symposium, and I'm going to, Travis, can you hear me? I'm going to try to explain how we're going to capture everything and where this material will be on our website, but we have videoed the entire symposium. And so by the end of next week, probably even maybe the end of this week, we will put links to the videos on our symposium homepage. And what Travis is going to do is explain at what time in the video certain presentations, speakers, and panelists happened on what day. So you'll be able to drill to that time, that day, in that video, okay? And the other thing is, I know that people have been asking about the slides from the slide presentations, and I've got a copy of all of the slides in my pocket. We will post those to the website as well. That might take a few days as well. So, and the slides are in a video. Daggum, you guys are great. I mean, promotions and bonuses. That's all I got to say. Okay. Also, please, if you have not visited the International Cadets poster sessions in the break room, please make an effort to do that today. And like yesterday, we've got coffee and juice and stuff in the break room. Without further ado, we'll introduce our next speaker.
Good morning. So our speaker this morning is Molly Dunigan. Dr. Dunigan is a senior political scientist and associate director of the Defense and Political Sciences Department at the RAND Corporation. Dr. Dunigan is also a lecturer at Carnegie Mellon University's Institute for Politics and Strategy. Her research interests focus on private military and security contractors, civilian-military relations, irregular warfare, counterinsurgency, maritime security, and civilian deployment. She's a recipient of numerous awards, including a U.S. Institute of Peace Jennings Randolph Peace Fellowship, a U.S. State Department Foreign Language Areas Studies Fellowship, and an International Studies Association Catalytic Research Grant. We talked yesterday about some of the books that Dr. Dunigan has published, and thank those of you who bought some of those books yesterday and had a chance to talk to her about those. Some of those books include Victory for Hire, Private Security Companies' Impact on Military Effectiveness, and The Markets for Force, Privatization of Security Across World Regions. In addition, Molly has been part of several RAND reports, including Expeditionary Civilians, Creating a Viable Practice of Department of Defense Civilian Deployment. This morning, Dr. Dunigan will be talking to us about the health and well-being of private contractors working in conflict environments, individual and strategic considerations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dunigan.
Thank you, Sharon, for that great introduction. So as Sharon said, I'm going to talk about a study that we did at RAND. This was a couple of years ago, looking at contractor health and well-being. So, is this going to work? It's not going to work? Is it on? I don't know. That's a good question. Do you have to turn these things on?
There we go.
Perfect. Thank you. Always the technical difficulties here with me. Okay, so why did we do this study? Well, prior to this work, the health and well-being of private contractors in conflict environments really had not been well understood and under-researched. So we looked at this because we thought that this could actually be an issue because contractors are an essential component of the force in many theaters of conflict, as we've been talking about for the past couple of days. They also are likely to be exposed to the same deployment-related stressors as military personnel. And extensive research has been done by a lot of my colleagues at RAND on the military health of military folks transnationally, but very little had been done on this issue. So we conducted an online survey to address this gap in the research. It was fielded for 2.5 months in early 2013. And you were eligible to complete the survey if you had currently or recently been employed as a contractor with a private contracting company providing services in a theater of conflict. That's how the language was written in the survey for the eligibility criteria. You had to have deployed on contract within the past 2 years, and we did that because we really wanted to show findings that were relevant at the time. We did get some pushback from folks who wanted to complete the survey, but were not eligible to do so because they had deployed before 2011. You had to be over age 18 just for legal purposes, and you had to provide informed consent. So as anybody who's ever conducted a survey knows, you have to sign those papers at the front. You had to do that for this as well. It was online and openly available, so we had quite a broad sample that responded, and I'll talk about the demographics of that sample throughout this briefing. In the survey, we adapted standardized scales to measure deployment experience, health, and healthcare use for this population. I'll talk about some of the scales that we used in a moment. And our survey questions and design were informed by an extensive literature review as well as interviews with contractors to sort of baseline test some of the wording for the questions and make sure it made sense. So bottom line up front, this is my teaser slide for the rest of the briefing. Contractors in our sample were found to have higher rates of probable mental health problems, both PTSD and depression, than military personnel and civilians. Contractors were reporting overall good health, but many were attributing ongoing health problems nonetheless to their time on contract. And only a third of contractors in our sample who were screening positive for probable mental health problems were receiving treatment. And about 70% were reporting that there were significant barriers to treatment along the lines of it being stigmatized, and they were unlikely to want to reach out and seek help. So there were some strengths and weaknesses of our study method. This was the largest known study to date on the issue. Like I said, there really had not been much done on this before we looked into it. In our literature review, we were able to find 2 other studies only of the private security contractor population. One had been done, it was published in a journal article. It was of South Africans. South African security contractors, I think they had done a survey of about 75 or 80 security contractors. And another had been done by one of the big US-based private security companies. And that was not published, but we actually talked to the psychologist who had used to be on staff there, and he told us what their results were. So we can't report any of that, but we knew that sort of for our own background knowledge. But so this was the largest study to date on the issue. We had 660 people start the survey, meet the eligibility criteria. About 512 finished the survey, and the only reason we think for people dropping off was that it was probably a bit too long. So for each of the questions, we utilized the total number of people that had applied, and that's where the percentage comes from. This was a transnational sample, so we were looking, as I said, it was online. If you were English speaking, it was easily accessible to you. I'll show the breakdown of the nationalities, but we had primarily US and UK citizens that were responding to it, but then I think something like 25 or 30 other countries were represented as well. And there were multiple job specialties and mission categories for contractors that were represented here. So it was not just security contractors, but I'll talk about those demographics in a second as well. And there are some weaknesses. One of the biggest weaknesses is we don't know how representative the sample is. It was a convenience sample, meaning we don't know the total number of people that potentially saw it and decided not to respond. We don't know what our denominator is there on our response rate. We couldn't really think of a way to get around this, just in terms of wanting to get it out to as broad of a population as possible. We really wanted it to be out to a transnational sample, not just one company. and to folks who are doing a variety of different specialties. And as most of you know, there's no one big contractor database for the world. So this was the best that we could do. I will say those two other studies that we had seen showed very similar rates of PTSD, like within a percentage point or two. So we actually do think that our findings are pretty robust, and we write about that in the report. And then we had a limited study scope in that, we were looking very much at mental and physical health problems. So really this was intended to be a very large scale and transnational, but also first cut at this issue. So how did we reach out to people and advertise the survey? So we tried to get around this problem of not having one big database of folks to look through by triangulating and sending it out through as many different recruitment channels as we could. So we utilized our personal networks, the researchers who were working on this. We went directly through several private contracting firms, 2 in the UK and 2 in the US, and they sent it out through their HR arms. We went through several contractor trade associations, International Stability Operations Association, which is having its big conference up in DC this week. We went through them. We also went through a UK-based security contractor trade association. Relevant listservs, if anybody's on Doug Brooks's AM/PM list or PSC's list, we went through those. And actually, I think that is probably how it went out most broadly, because he has a readership of about 20,000 people, I think, on those listservs. And we went through relevant blogs and web forums. We really tried to target a couple of contractor relevant blogs that were really seen as fairly robust. I think Danger Zone Jobs was one, and Feral Hundi was another, if anybody is familiar with those. So as I mentioned, we assessed multiple characteristics. We assessed demographic characteristics. One demographic characteristic that we did not assess here was gender, and we did that intentionally because we did not want to have such a small pool of people responding in a certain way that they might potentially be identifiable. And we thought if we were looking at the breakdown of females versus males, there are so few females in the industry that they might actually be identifiable. So we didn't ask about that, but we asked about age, citizenship, education, and marital status. We asked about deployment experiences, which I'll talk about. Some of the charts I have really get into detail on those. We utilized standardized scales to look at mental and physical health, and I'll talk about those more in a second. And then we looked at healthcare use. So to get into just some of the demographics of who responded, to give you some sense of what the population looked like, the majority of respondents' most recent contracts were for the Department of Defense and Department of State, but as you can see, we actually did have a diversity of folks working across a lot of different types of contracts. Most folks had, on their most recent contract, held a training, advising, or land security job. We distinguished land security, which was convoy security, static site security, or personal security details, as opposed to maritime security. So as you can see, even though we weren't just targeting private security contractors, they are fairly heavily represented here. As I mentioned before, most of the respondents were either UK or US citizens. Again, probably not that surprising. It was an English-speaking survey. We put it out and we sent it out through 2 US and 2 UK firms. But Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand were also represented. And in this 5% bucket over here on the far right, that is 25 different countries, including Italy, Macedonia. I mean, it's really all across the map. So looking at the research questions, and I'm going to talk about our findings in regard to, the first was looking at the deployment experiences. And again, this was relevant to try to figure out how closely were contractor and military deployment experiences mapped on top of each other. And so what would you then expect about their healthcare needs and the types of issues that they might face? So we found that length of deployment amongst our respondents varied quite widely. I will say the things to focus on here are the 7+ months, which is about 1/5 of our sample had deployed for that long on their most recent contract. And then fully 1/3 of the folks that were responding to the survey were currently deployed, which I'll get back to this in a second, but remember that that's really relevant. With regard to pre-deployment preparation, so we asked these questions and they basically had to say yes or no. The interesting thing here was that we found that most people answered it fairly negatively. Only about a quarter were in agreement with the statement, "My contracting company provided me with adequate stress management training." So we found that that was potentially something for companies to focus on moving forward. We also were looking for levels of combat exposure, again, trying to figure out the extent to which contractors might be at risk for some of the deployment-related health issues that the military is at risk for. And we found that most of the respondents, 73%, were exposed to some sort of combat. With regard to other deployment experiences, we found that the military and contractors were reporting similar experiences to what we see in the military. Their level of preparedness for deployment was similar on average to what we've seen in similar military surveys. They had comparable rates of combat exposure, but interestingly, contractors, for the most part, were reporting better living conditions while deployed than the military. And we hear about this sort of in an ad hoc fashion, but I thought that this was a really interesting finding here. So then getting into the real meat of the survey, looking at the mental health status of contractors. So we did use standardized self-reporting scales, and what I say when I mean that, I am not a health expert, but the woman that I co-led the study with, Carrie Farmer, is a military mental health expert and has done a lot of surveys related to military mental health problems. So I took her recommendation and we utilized several standardized scales to do this. So basically, people were self-reporting, but they were not saying, yes, I've been diagnosed with PTSD. They were figuring out, going through a series of questions that would then end up giving them a score that would help us to understand if they had PTSD or depression or unhealthy alcohol use, which has a specific connotation. So we found that mental health issues were prevalent, and I'll say this 25% of probable PTSD is quite notable when you consider that among U.S. military populations, scores for probable PTSD range anywhere from 8 to 20%, depending on how you're measuring it. So 25% is quite high and quite notable. Probable depression, also 18% higher than we see amongst military populations. Alcohol misuse is 47%. Now, when Carrie briefs this part of it, she always, says most of us would probably score in the positive on alcohol misuse. That's like you have to drink something like 2 drinks a day several times a week. So that is not surprising that that's quite high. But high-risk drinking, 10%, is quite high. That's quite extensive drinking. And then also tobacco use is fairly high. So interestingly, the labels are sort of cut off here at the bottom, but when you look at how these findings are cut when you cross-tabulate them across folks' specialties, job specialties, we find that the highest percentages for PTSD, which is the blue line, are amongst folks performing transportation duties. So these are truckers for the most part, and not surprising given the fact that a lot of them had just come out of theaters where they were getting hit with IEDs pretty frequently. And these were folks who don't necessarily have prior military experience, so they might not have had any sort of resiliency training for something like that. But I should say, too, that our transportation sample was fairly small. I'm trying to remember exactly what the figures were, but it was something like 16 people or something. So the fact that the 50% there might look a little bit deceiving. But trainers and land security was also quite high, and we did have, as I noted before on that pie chart, we did have very large percentages of folks in those areas that responded to the survey. The other interesting thing we always like to note here is that maritime security contracting is apparently a very safe one to go into to avoid mental health problems, because only 4% of the maritime security contractors were showing any problems. Interestingly, so we briefed this all over the place when the study came out in late 2013. We traveled over to London and briefed it to audiences in the UK, and we briefed it in Washington as well. And interestingly, when you brief this to a room full of UK citizens, they don't look surprised at all by this, and they say it's just because the UK citizens have more of a stiff upper lip than folks in the US. They were quite serious about that. But US citizens are showing much higher rates than UK citizens or citizens from other countries here. And we did not really hypothesize as to why. We didn't dig in as to why, but that would be a really interesting thing to research more in the future. Longer deployments were also associated with probable PTSD and depression, which makes sense. I mean, more time to potentially have some sort of traumatic event. But this is why I told you to remember how high the proportion of folks were who had gone on long deployments in our sample and who were currently deployed. So if you remember, 33% of the sample were currently deployed while they were completing the survey, online survey. If they had internet access, they could do that while deployed. 23% of those were screening positive for probable PTSD. And as I will show in a later slide, most of these people were not seeking treatment for it. So we found this to be potentially one of the most troubling findings of the survey. PTSD is a very treatable condition, but it definitely, if it's not treated, can lead to problems with productivity, occupational functioning. And so this is something that needs to be addressed amongst the contractor population. So what other health issues affect contractors? Starting to look at the physical health issues. So we did focus a lot on mental health issues in the study, but we found it interesting that on the one hand, respondents reported, for the most part, they were pretty healthy, but then about 40% also reported having had a physical health problem as a result of a deployment on contract. And these really sort of went across the map. Some of the labels got knocked off here when I was reformatting this last night. I apologize, but the top, like the most extensive finding we had were that orthopedic problems were the biggest one, which is perhaps not surprising. Respiratory problems were also really high, and we hypothesized that some of that may be due to the burn pits that contractors were asked to run or were exposed to on the bases. But as you can see, this went sort of across the map. Now, for this one, we did not have a standardized scale. We actually had an open text box, and we asked people, I think they had 150 characters to write about physical health problems, and then we went in and coded them. So went all the way down to leishmaniasis. Does everybody know what leishmaniasis is? I learned a lot, actually, on this. It's sand fleas. I had no idea. But so a couple of these things, you can see there are some mental health issues that people wrote into that box as well. We really took those out when we were looking at this. So we sort of crossed out anxiety, substance abuse, relationship issues, and we put those in the mental health bucket. The physical health conditions also varied by specialty. Again, transportation, very high, very risky job for those contractors. Training, advising, and land security, also pretty high. Maritime security is still very low. So the mental and physical health issues really did map on one another in terms of who was affected by these. Again, U.S. citizens were reporting more physical health problems than other nationalities, and we're not sure why, but there are definitely different hypotheses about that. And then looking at access to care. So I will say this study was completed before the Affordable Care Act was in place in the United States. So this probably has changed to some extent since the ACA has been in place. But before that, we found that most of the respondents were insured, but U.S. citizens were less likely to be insured. And interestingly, one of the things we found, and many of you who have worked as contractors may know this, if you are working as a contractor, you typically only have insurance from the company while you are on the contract. Sometimes you'll have it for a couple of months past the end date of the contract. There is something called Defense Base Act insurance, and this has been, there have been numerous reports on this. T. Christian Miller in ProPublica has actually written a number of reports about problems with the Defense Base Act and how it's essentially put out there to be government insurance, government-sponsored insurance for anybody supporting U.S. operations on an overseas U.S. base. I'll talk more about it in a moment, but we found that there were some problems with that. So, but you can see the U.S. line here is the blue line, UK is the red line, and other countries are the green line. So the U.S. folks were, about a third of them had insurance from their contracting company, and then they had potential from other sources. Now, interestingly, when you cross-tabulate those findings with the findings on PTSD and depression, we found that nearly a quarter of those with mental or physical health conditions were uninsured. Here we go, the DBA claims. So this is what I was just talking about. We asked one question in here about whether folks had ever filed a DBA claim. And what we were reading in the literature was that DBA claims were often being held up or denied without cause, particularly for mental health problems, because it was very difficult for any contractor with a deployment-related mental health issue who had been a veteran previously of a state military to prove that their deployment-related mental health issue had occurred while they were working on contract and not while in the military. And if that's the case, if it's difficult to prove, then you don't get your claim approved. The other thing that we were hearing was that these DBA claims were held up in an appeals process for sometimes years, and people were having a really hard time getting their claim passed. So interestingly, though, when we asked about this in the survey, we did not get much traction with the findings. Very few of our sample had actually filed a DBA claim, but the majority of those who had filed one, it had been approved. And you can see the blue slice is those who had filed for a physical health claim. The red slice is so small that you can't see it. It's 0.2%. That was just for a mental health claim. The green little 2.5% is for both a physical health and mental health claim, and almost 84% said they had never filed a claim. So either they don't know about it or they weren't working for a U.S. funder and weren't eligible for it. U.S. respondents did have higher rates of healthcare use in general when we asked about that. So again, the United States is the blue line here, so they had more visits on average than most other nationalities to a healthcare provider in the past year. And most respondents with probable PTSD or depression had received no mental health treatment, and we'll get into why in a second. Respondents also reported little access to company-provided mental health resources, and we thought that this was an interesting finding and again, spoke to something that the industry could do to help out this population. So 23% reported that they had received adequate stress management training before their recent deployment on contract. 26% reported that they had adequate resources to help with stress while deployed, and 17% had access to resources to help with post-deployment stress problems. Most were also unlikely to report a mental health condition to a supervisor or company official, which we also found troubling. And we did brief this when we were sort of on our speaking tour about it. We briefed it pretty extensively across the industry in the US and the UK. And I think there have been some slight changes made on a company-by-company basis, but there have not been big things that have been done to address this for this population, as far as I know. Interestingly, this gets into why folks would not want to self-report these problems and seek help. I think it's really interesting that 70% of those who met criteria for PTSD or depression thought that it would harm their career if they actually reached out on this. So the messaging needs to be changed on this. 68% thought that their colleagues might have less confidence in them, and 71% thought that their supervisor or other officials at their company might treat them differently. So then finally, again, when we went on our speaking tour about this, what were some of our recommendations? We did argue that both companies and clients, including the Department of Defense and the UK MOD, need to increase access to stress management and mental health resources, including training, pre- and post-deployment training for folks leaving and coming back on contract. Resources in theater for contractors. We often found that contractors were pushed out of some of the military mental health resources in theater and were not given access to those. And then post-deployment resources as well. And then finally, you really need to implement strategies to reduce the stigma here on this issue. And so we recommended corporate messaging, as I just said, but also team leader training. So your team lead might be able to recognize if one of his team has any of these issues and help encourage him or her to seek help. And then, of course, we're RAND, so our thing is to always recommend additional research, right? Because we're really actually interested in trying to do research. This is not just a pitch. But so the additional research that we recommended, we're looking at questions such as these. How can companies balance vetting options with treatment options and the provision of resources? What kinds of resources to cope with stress do companies provide? Are these effective? How could they be made more effective? What are the economic benefits and risks to companies in providing or not providing these types of resources? Why are there differences by job specialty in rates of health problems, and how can those be mitigated? How does prior military experience affect the mental health of contractors? And what physical health problems are associated with deployments on contract, and what causes those specific problems? So drilling deeper into the physical health side of things. And I would say, I mean, just in the context of yesterday's conversation, I think it would be really interesting to, I wish Eric Prince was still here, to sort of ask, you know, how would you propose addressing these things if we're going to go back into a theater, both vetting for these issues, not that folks with PTSD or depression are more likely to have any sort of violent interchange with local civilians, but it does potentially impact their productivity. There's been a lot of research on that. So I think it's an interesting dialogue to have, and one that we need to keep having, which is why I keep briefing this 4 years later. Anyway, thank you so much. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Molly, for a very informative talk. Do you have any data that correlates the number of deployments with any of these manifesting themselves in the contractors?
So there was that one slide that shows, it's pretty early on here, that shows the more 7+ deployments is a much higher rate of these things. It's much more likely.
Molly, thank you. That was great. Excellent presentation. And I just want to add some things here. I started scratching the surface now in South Africa on this particular subject. Just during the last month, I registered a charity organization because there is nobody in South Africa addressing this problem with private military contractors. Even our military folks are forgotten from the old days. And what I found is in South Africa, it's a very unmanly talk to have. People don't talk about it because, you know, we were brought up not to talk about these kind of problems. And it stems from our military days as well. And the South Africans by nature are secretive, so they don't talk. But what I've seen with friends and with colleagues is definitely some of the signs you've mentioned there. Heavy drinking is one problem, aggression is another problem, marital problems is, you know, rears its head. So it's a wonderful exercise this, and I would like to, you know, look in South Africa how we can maybe add to your study and how we can take it further. The fact of the matter is a lot of South Africans got injured in Iraq. A lot of them didn't understand DBA-based insurance, especially in the beginning here. So if I talk about the old Iraq, I'll say from 2003 till 2011, December, when the US forces withdrew, and the new Iraq is now subsequently 2012 until currently. And in the old Iraq, we worked mainly on USG contracts, the contractors, and we had insurance, but it was never explained to us as South Africans. So a lot of them got injured, a lot of them has got mental health problems, but they never knew how to claim, and they didn't want to talk about it in fear of losing their work. Yeah. And I had severely wounded people that just stayed in theater because they needed to keep working to feed their families. So that was a big problem. The other observation I've got is a lot of the third country nationals, like the Fijians and the Ugandans, and even the local nationals, the Iraqis that worked on the same contracts as us, especially the local nationals, they were the ones that took the first blasts and the first, you know, when there was explosions, it was at your gate or it was at your perimeter, and they were the shields. And a lot of them got killed and maimed. And I found that a lot of them never received any treatment or any compensation from the companies. We're talking mostly about Westerners and foreigners here in this study, but we're not talking about local nationals and third country nationals. So there's a big problem, I think, from the companies that employ these people's side. First of all, not explaining the insurance to them, and second of all, not helping them. Now, I'm currently busy with a DBA claim myself, and it's been going on for over a year, and I've met a lot of resistance, but, you know, I got a lawyer in Washington that's busy sorting it and so on. So there's also a resistance, I think, not a resistance, but it seems to be very difficult to get claims done by foreigners especially. So, and PTSD is something that needs to be addressed. I think it's a wonderful presentation, good work done. It's just some observations that I had from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, to elaborate a little bit on the DBA thing. So the DBA is a law that's been in place in the U.S. since the early 1940s. I mean, this is sort of post-World War II. And the actual insurance program itself is run by the insurance company AIG. And so, again, I'll refer you to T. Christian Miller, who has done some wonderful work on this. He's written like 9 or 10 articles sort of exposing the extent to which AIG tries to make it difficult to file these claims. You're right. I mean, the government does not make it clear the process for doing so. Clients don't make it clear to the companies who are hiring, particularly foreigners, how to do this and that they are eligible. So if an Iraqi is working on a DoD-funded contract, they're technically eligible to file a DBA claim if they get injured, but most don't know that, and the information is just really, really difficult for them to track down. And what we've heard sort of anecdotally and through T. Christian Miller's work is the fact that you do have to get a lawyer, and it can take over a year. And so you have to have the money to pay the lawyer in order to do it. So it's just really, really an uphill battle. But I will say in conversations that we've had, and I just had this conversation with Eric here last night about how he handles these things with his company. And a lot of the company officials do say, well, once their contract ends, they're eligible for DBA insurance. And DBA has been around since the 1940s. And so it's sort of glossed over as being a Band-Aid, which is not actually there for most people.
Do you suppose that I'm struck by the disproportionate number of U.S. versus UK and others. You suppose that's because we have an extremely loose definition here for what constitutes a symptom of PTSD? For example, the VA, at the VA there is a presumption that just by having been deployed to a combat theater that you are a candidate for PTSD.
Well, for the mental health findings, they were not self-reporting those. I mean, they were filling out questionnaires with, types of questions like, are you having nightmares? Different things like that would then give us a score, and we could score them. So I think, we did get the one hypothesis put forth by folks in the UK that they just have a more stiff upper lip. I think there could be some cultural mores in when it's acceptable to talk about these things as opposed to really keep them inside, and what the cultural stigmas are there. So that's probably what's going on. That would be my guess, but we didn't dig into it.
Molly, kind of as a follow-up to that, have you compared the numbers you found for PTSD and depression with the overall American population?
Yes, and I don't off the top of my head remember those, but I know the overall American population it's lower than the U.S. military. So again, U.S. military is 8 to 20% depending on how you're measuring it, and the overall population is somewhere like 4 to 7%. So this is quite high. And I think our hypothesis right now about why it's so high is that treatment is stigmatized and not provided. I think if the military did not have as many treatment programs to catch these things and treat them as they do at this point, then the military numbers could be that high as well.
Hi, my name is Kim Massey. I'm an assistant professor of nursing here at University of North Georgia. I'm also a nurse practitioner, and I've cared for patients returning from combat, whether contractors or active military. And so I kind of wanted to speak because my background, my research background is with military fathers, especially of young children, and their deployment to combat. So what I'm wanting to just kind of review the yesterday's presentations, and I know Colonel Kansian talked about how contractors are being used to augment the United States military, much like he referred to how the Reserves and National Guard were brought back in the 70s, and now there are no benefits to support these contractors. And then Chris Rothery, of course, identified that in New Zealand, how the veterans coming back, whether from military or from contracting, are having issues, extreme issues, especially with PTSD. And then, of course, Eric Prince talked yesterday about how the plan for these contractors is to embed them in country for longer periods of time. And we know through research that these long, frequent deployments with very short at-home recovery time leads to greater mental health issues. So if they're not providing any benefits for these contractors, male or female, during the deployment, and then especially when they return home to support their post-deployment issues, are we, as in our government, at DoD levels and Department of State levels, are we looking at discussions to provide support for these contractors? Okay, we are.
It's a great question.
Right,
no,
you.
so I'm glad that you asked it. So there's this whole issue of duty of care, right? And so when we've briefed this to both contractor officials, and CEOs, as well as military and Department of Defense officials, and UK MOD officials and DFID officials in the UK, they really get into a very heated debate about whose responsibility it is to care for this population. So the client funders often say, well, it's the company's responsibility. And the companies say, well, that should be, they have DBA insurance, or this should be DoD's responsibility, or whoever the big client is. And so the personnel themselves just sort of fall down into that gap. It's an ongoing debate. Like I said, we did the research about 5 years ago. And we briefed it very, very extensively. We were working really hard to get follow-on research for this because it was quite important. And we just kept getting stuck in that loop of whose duty of care is it. So I think it's really important to keep talking about for that reason. And, I do think that if we are going to privatize the war in Afghanistan or do any sort of big deployment like that, this needs to be part of the debate and sort of contractually inserted into the language of the contract before we go in.
Hi, Molly. Thanks for a great presentation. I wanted to follow up some of the discussion about stigma. And I know at RAND a couple possible ways to reduce stigma in accessing mental health care are access to chaplains and access to mental health care that's embedded in primary care teams. And I just wanted to see if you had looked at any of those options or had some thoughts.
We hadn't. No, those are great ideas. Yeah, I think further work along those lines should definitely happen.
Molly, great presentation. I wonder, have you looked at the impact on the families? Where I'm staying, I see the impact on the families, and it's really, really disruptive. You have a dad that's flying in every 6 months for 2 weeks, and he's splashing a lot of money onto the family, and then he's out.
So we have not done research on that, but I think it would be a really interesting vein of work to look into. I mean, we've done a lot of work on military families and different issues about reintegration, post-deployment. DoD has a lot of reintegration programs and military family support, so that would be a really interesting line of research to look into as well.
Molly, did any of your research look at the quality of pre-employment medical checks by the companies for individual contractors?
We didn't go too much into detail with that. We just asked the extent to which they had been doing any sort of, they'd gone through any sort of vetting, or not just a check, but like a pre-deployment resiliency training, and we found that it was really, really minimal.
Do we have any more questions?
just want to make the point that in my presentation I talked about the process of bringing reservists into the total force, and that took 30 or 40 years to work through all the processes and mechanisms. And this is one of the issues that they face, because reservists, when they come back from a deployment, don't go to a military base for the most part. They're out in the community and didn't have the resources that active duty would. So there were programs instituted whereby reservists could get ongoing care for medical problems. But it took a long time to get to that, and I think this is part of that process for contractors, and it may take a while to get there.
Right. It's great context to keep in mind.
One more question.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm a civilian full-time, always have been, so I'm trying to swim through a lot of information through this very powerful symposium from my perspective. But has there been any research done, or proposed research, looking into just the overall societal costs, not only from the experiences of veterans trying to get assistance from the VA, but contractors trying to get public or private health coverage, stigma or not, because it seems that there's also a political element in this as well, where there's a stigma coming from, well, I hate to mention it, but the incident recently in California, where these individuals need a lot of professional help, but the cost societally, families, individual, but also communities at large. Has there been any research done in this area?
I am not familiar with any research that has been done on that, but I think that would be a really interesting area to look into further.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So fast. Okay, Molly, first off, thank you so much for your presentation and your panel work. But also, most of you may or may not know, she was very instrumental in helping put this thing together. And so we want to thank you. You know what's in the box. So I'm going to just give it to you. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we need everybody back in your seats at 10 o'clock. So we get about, what, 16 or 17 minutes.
the
Okay, if everybody can take their seats, please.
Okay, a little lighter this morning than we were yesterday, but I hope nobody's sleeping in after the social last night. It's my distinct privilege to introduce Dr. Sean McFate as our next guest speaker. Dr. McFate is an author, a novelist, and an expert in foreign policy and national security strategy. He is a professor at the National Defense University and Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Recently, he was a visiting scholar at Oxford University's Changing Character of War program, and he's also a think tank scholar at the RAND Corporation, or has been, at the Atlantic Council, the Bipartisan Policy Center, and the New America Foundation. Dr. McFate's career began as a paratrooper, like several in this room. In the 82nd Airborne Division, he has served under Stanley McChrystal and David Petraeus, names familiar to us all. Following his time in the Army, McFate became a private military contractor in Africa. Among his many experiences, he dealt with warlords, raised small armies, worked with armed groups in the Sahara, transacted arms deals in Eastern Europe, and helped prevent an impending genocide in the Rwanda region. Dr. McFate is an accomplished author, as I mentioned. By the way, he has a book for sale back here that he'd be more than happy to autograph for you. Pertinent to our discussions here, he authored the nonfiction book, The Modern Mercenary, Private Armies, and What They Mean for World Order, which explains how some of the privatization of war is changing the world order. His newest book, The New Rules of War, Victory in the Age of Durable Disorder, will be released in January of 2019. And so we look forward to seeing that. Dr. McFate is a much sought-out speaker, has published articles in a wide range of periodicals, and has appeared as a commentator on numerous news and educational programs. He has some significant academic qualifications. He holds a BA from Brown University, an MPP from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and a PhD in International Relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science. He lives in Washington, D.C., and please welcome Dr. Sean McFate.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for hosting me and this great conference. It's a spectacular conference, and I think all of you should feel very lucky that they got Euban Barlow yesterday, which is really very rare. Having myself worked on the continent for several years, there's an EO sort of alumni network in place in Africa that's very active. In fact, what we saw in Nigeria a few years ago drew from that. And he doesn't come out much. So I would say treasure that. That's a rare opportunity. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the future of the privatization of war and what it means for you, what it means for future leaders, particularly future leaders in national security, which many in this room will become. This is a speech given by General Patton the day before D-Day, June 5th, 1944. In it, he says, Americans hate to lose. Losing is hateful for Americans. The problem is, ever since 1944, America and the West has not decisively won wars. And the question is, and this is provocative, is why? Why is that the case? You know, Korea was a stalemate. Vietnam went communist. Iraq, Afghanistan, few would call that a decisive victory. In fact, Eric Prince was up here yesterday making a case why we should privatize Afghanistan because it's not a success. And things that are not successes sometimes are called failures. So here, this book asks this question. Why has America, and it's not just America, it's also the West. Why has it stopped winning wars? And the implications of that are terrifying if you think about it. One reason is, well, the other question is, the West and those who represent militaries in this room have the best troops, have the best training, have the best technology, have the most money. So what's the problem, right? My favorite is this thing right here, the F-35. It costs $1.5 trillion for this program. That is more than Russia's GDP. Think about that. If this plane were a national economy, it'd rank 11th in the world. All right? The U.S. has fought, and its allies have fought 2 long wars. How many combat missions did this plane see? Does anybody know? 0. 0. The measurement of any weapon is its utility. And we're still buying a lot more of them. Right? Meanwhile, things that do work, like infantry, special operations, and others, not enough there. Always deployed over the time. The reason I say in this book why we are struggling is we have something I call strategic atrophy. And it's not just me, it's also Secretary of Defense Mattis. It means low strategic IQ. That's what I said, not Mattis. Low strategic IQ. We need to rethink war. The problem is this, is that there's a saying that generals always fight the last war. What it really means is generals always fight the last successful war. And for the West, that war was World War II. And the paradigm of warfare remains World War II, a conventional war. It's an interstate war fought by industrial-sized militaries fueled by nationalism and patriotism, right? In a sort of a laws of war type context. We know what this looks like. We've seen there's World War II movies still being produced to this day. This fuels things like Red Storm Rising, Tom Clancy's huge international bestseller in the 1980s. And all the lookalikes like Tom Clancy since then. This book imagines World War III. It came out in like '86. It imagines World War III between a hyper-aggressive Soviet Union fighting the West, fighting NATO, using conventional war. Nukes were conspicuously absent in this, making it highly unrealistic. But the world embraced it. Despite the fact, does anybody know what the Soviet Union was doing in the 1980s when this book came out? It was busy imploding. It was busy imploding. And the guy who proposed most of all in Washington that the Soviet Union was a huge threat because he had been reading too much Tom Clancy and not enough cables was Bob Gates, CIA, head of the analysis for the CIA on the Soviet Union. One of the greatest intelligence failures in history. Of course, he got promoted to DCI, the head of the intelligence, and then he became Secretary of Defense, which shows you that shows you a little bit about how Washington works, I guess. I'll leave it there. But we still see today, when you ask people about what they think the future war is, it's World War II with better technology. That's what it is. That's what the National Defense Strategy that this came out reiterates. Things like Call of Duty. Anybody here play Call of Duty? Be honest. Okay, nobody's raising their hands, but we all know who you are. Call of Duty, a great game. But it's essentially all these first-person shooters, they're very tactical and kinetic. Meanwhile, we see people like Putin and Russia taking over vast swaths of places like Ukraine and Crimea, not with tanks and bombers, but through other means, including mercenaries. We see the South China Sea. We see what China is doing in the South China Sea. How many carrier groups do they have? 0. Yet they're winning over islands and they're making them. So the utility of force for the 21st century is going down. So this is dangerously wrong because it puts us on a wrong strategic IQ path. War has moved on, and we have to move on with it. Our adversaries know this, and our adversaries are not just states, as you know. Conventional warfare is basically state-on-state warfare. And this is what the book is about. It proposes 10 new principles of war, all right, for how to win, how to reimagine war and warfare for the 20th century, and what we need to do to win. It's meant to remedy strategic atrophy. Now, a few heads will explode in the Pentagon over this book. That's okay. But today what I want to talk to you about is this rule number 6. Mercenaries will return. Mercenaries are returning, present tense. That is one of the new rules of war. Okay? First of all, mercenaries are the second oldest profession. The Bible mentions them several times. Romans lived off of them. I mean, the Roman Empire, think about it. They only had 26 to 30 legions throughout their entire empire. Do you know how many people were in a legion? About 6,500? 6,000? Well, who was everybody else? A good number of them were mercenaries. All right? In the Middle Ages, we saw war was done by mercenaries. That's how people fought wars. The reason is obvious. Standing armies are extremely expensive. Renting is cheaper than owning. Also, standing armies, when I was in Africa doing some strange work, one of the heads of the UN missions there said that armies in Africa, at least, are only good for playing cards and plotting coups. Having a standing army around is very dangerous for political authority. The founders of our country knew that. In the Constitution, in our Constitution, is there a standing army clause? No. There is one for the Navy, but not for the Army. Congress has the power to raise an army. Such was the distrust of standing armies. Okay? In the Middle Ages, or early Renaissance, mercenaries were not called mercenaries. They were called condottieri, which in Old Italian means contractor, just like today. They formed multinational transalpine corporations, just like today's private military and security corporations in many ways, with hierarchies of leadership. You have a contract. They'd have booty clauses. They're not the booty you think, for all you cadets out there. But like your share of the wealth, right? They were organized, and they were professional, organized mercenary forces. That's how, and everybody hired them. Popes hired them. Everybody hired them. Mercenaries were around for a very long time, okay? Now, there's a relationship between private military force and world order. Do this very quickly. First, second oldest profession, most of military history is privatized history, privatized military history. Mercenaries were never stigmatized. They were just seen as a bloody but honorable trade. You had sons of aristocrats becoming condottieri captains, very famous ones. And they would take over states, like in Milan, the Sforza destiny. And Sforza was somebody's nome de guerre, means force in Italian, took over Milan and became like the Duke of Milan. That's how a lot of dukedoms occurred in the early Renaissance, by force. The market has always been there because private military force is cheaper. In our own country, the Congressional Budget Office ran a study comparing a battalion of infantry versus a comparable unit of Blackwater, and found that Blackwater is cheaper in wartime, and then in peacetime, what is cheaper, Blackwater or the infantry? Blackwater is cheaper because the contract goes away. There's zero cost. Whereas you're paying an infantry battalion, to be at Fort Bragg or wherever doing their thing. So contracting, at least in the short term, is cheaper. In the long term is up for debate. The 30 Years' War was a war from 1618 to 1648 across Central Europe. It wiped out percentage-wise more Germans than World War II. It was devastating. And it was fought mostly by mercenary. You had armies, 50,000 versus 50,000, mostly mercenary. And it was destructive. And then mercenaries would prey on the people. It was horrible. In 1648, the Peace of Westphalia occurred. Now, this is where most political scientists and international relations theorists think that the nation states were birthed. That's up for debate. We're not going to have that debate today. But one of the things that nation states did is they monopolized the market for force. They seized control of the market by investing in powerful standing militaries. And they outlawed mercenary forces, and they chase them away or kill them. This is the origin of the stigma against mercenary force. It only occurred a couple hundred years ago. But mercenaries were used extensively until the mid-19th century. Both mercenaries and privateers, which are mercenaries of the high sea, were used until like 1850s, the Crimea War and the Treaty of Paris of 1854 or 56, I forget. Warfare became, at this point, exclusively state-on-state. The norms of the battlefield, which were codified in the Hague and Geneva Conventions, came from this period. And actually, what informed the Hague Convention was actually happened here with the Lieber Code in 1864-63, the Civil War here, right? But this is our paradigm. This is, I'm tracing back the lineage of this idea of what warfare is in the conventional mind. This is the Westphalian Order. It's state-on-state conflict. Mercenaries are not a part of it. And we think of it as universal and timeless because it was spread in the age of empire through colonies. But it's not universal, it's not timeless, it's less than 200 years old, which is nothing in human history. And guess what? We are going back to the status quo ante. Mercenaries are back. This is normal. This is not abnormal. Most of human history has featured private military force, and there was no stigma. Now, these mercenaries are American, ex-SEALs, ex-Green Berets, now being hired by the Emirates as hunter-killer teams in the war in Yemen. The world, once again, is becoming what I call durable disorder, sort of an endless, persistent conflict. But it's not a situation like where the sky is falling, we have to invest in more sky. It's going to look a little bit like the Middle Ages, without getting into that right now. We're seeing mercenaries pop up everywhere. I've seen a lot of the cadet poster boards, a lot in the Wagner group. Very interesting development. We see mercenaries helping terrorists like Jasra, the Nusra Front. There's Uzbek Sunni mercenaries who did professionalize and train them around Raqqa. We're seeing mercenaries all over Kurdistan. Erbil, who here has been to Erbil? Anybody? Yeah? I mean, Erbil is sort of like a mercenary mecca for lone guys who show up looking to do something, working with a Peshmerga, looking to kill ISIS, whomever. And it's sort of like that bar from Star Wars, you know? But you know, it's become a huge area, especially in 2014-15 when ISIS was at its peak. We're seeing Latin American ex-Special Forces mercenaries hired by UAE to go kill Houthis in Yemen. They're very effective. They're good value because they are tough soldiers who have combat experience fighting narcos and communists throughout Latin America, many of them which are trained by U.S. Special Operations Forces. And they're about 1/4 the price of Eric Prince or me. I'm not in the business anymore. He is, so I'm going to just pick on him a little bit. We saw in Nigeria, remember we talked about the Executive Outcomes Alumni Network? That was in Nigeria in 2015. Did you cover this yesterday at all? Okay, so Boko Haram. I mean, Nigeria is a regional hegemon in West Africa. Their military is not weak. For 6 years, they could not deal with Boko Haram. They hired some of Barlow's old guys and some others, and they took care of it in a few weeks. We can debate about how much they took care of it. They pushed Boko Haram out into their neighbor's backyard, which is a classic military strategy. It's effective. And they showed up. The problem is, like, people think that mercenaries are like the 1960s. They show up with like a lone, Kalashnikov. No, these guys showed up with Mi-24s, Hind helicopters. You can rent Special Operations Forces teams. They can be very good, very good. We're seeing what I call privateers. They're not really privateers, but maritime security. We have hackback companies, which are like cyber mercenaries. And we've seen Africa, all over Africa, remains a big place. Eric Prince, right? Privatizing the war in Afghanistan. Most in Washington find this to be an absolutely ridiculous idea. There's some good reasons and some bad reasons for that. I wish he was here today. My only thing is that he's never done this. He was basically a bodyguard company in Iraq for diplomats. I spent several years in Africa raising small armies for U.S. interest, and his plan is not going to work. We can do that in Q&A if you wish, but the bottom line is that well, we can say it for Q&A. It's simple solutions for complex problems guarantee failure. That's all I'll say. Okay, so why are military contractors coming back? Well, one is because it's inevitable. It's actually part of warfare. The last 200 years has been the exception, not the norm. The other reason, and then there was people like Executive Outcomes, which pioneered it, but it really wasn't until the U.S. experience in Iraq and Afghanistan that launched this industry by infusing it with a few $billion of capital. Now, to the point here, this shows you contractors are in red, troops are in blue. You can see this pattern. In Afghanistan, there are more contractors than troops, like a 3-to-1 ratio, versus World War II, where it was at 10%. Now, to be fair, only about 12 to 15% of these contractors were trigger pullers. So most of the contractors, the vast majority, are just serving chow or repairing trucks. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the trigger pullers. And the difference between a private military contractor and a mercenary, in my opinion, in my book, Modern Mercenary, which is an academic book, I go into some of the nuance, but bottom line is this. If you can do one, you can do the other. It's a question of market circumstances and the individual's decision. That's what it comes down to. If you can do one, you can do the other. It's a very blurry line. This 15%, though, is enough to launch a worldwide industry. Because after the US left Iraq and Afghanistan, they are not reservists from World War II who demobilized and integrated into the civilian workforce. They sought new clients. And also, others have imitated this model, like the Wagner Group. Can the US really wag its finger, to use a bad pun, at Moscow for using them when we have done this? You could say, well, it's not the same thing. Well, that's not what Moscow hears, and it's certainly not what Iraq hears or Afghanistan. So why would you want to hire mercenaries? There's a lot of reasons. One, to wage war. So one of the people who hires these folks now are the extractive industry, oil, gas, et cetera. Because now you have a market glut of military contractors coming out of Afghanistan, coming out of Iraq, who are looking for work. Well, guess what? There's supply and demand. Second is you want them for plausible deniability, and this is very powerful about the future of war. We live in an information age. In such an age, plausible deniability can be more powerful than firepower. Look at how Moscow took over the Crimea. Russia has the ability to do a blitzkrieg into eastern Ukraine, but they chose clandestine means like Spetsnaz, mercenaries, proxy militia, and then their huge media machine, right? Propaganda. They blew a Boeing 777 out of the air. Nothing happened. They stole the Crimea. Nothing happened. One of the reasons nothing happened in the Crimea is that by the time the tanks and the ships showed up, it was a fait accompli, because their clandestine means had already seized everything that needed to be seized in Crimea. Okay? That's the way warfare is going. Warfare is going underground. Mercenaries are cheaper. We talked about that. Mercenaries are bloodless. Americans hate seeing Marines come back in body bags. They don't notice contractors. So, and Russia's the same way. One reason that Moscow uses the Wagner Group is because nobody's too fussed in Russia about dead contractors. Americans killed more Russians on February 7th this past year than the entire Cold War in sort of one battle. It's amazing if you think about it. Mercenaries also hire niche capabilities. If you want to just rent a soft team or an Mi-24 gunship for 3 weeks, you can do it. You don't actually have to pay for a whole program to do it now. You can use them to professionalize your security, which is common, and loyalty. Everybody thinks of Machiavelli as like, oh, mercenaries are faithless. I just spent the last three months this past year in his archives in Florence. Machiavelli was just a really incompetent assistant secretary of defense who got burned by his mercenaries and was really bitter, and it came out in this book called The Prince. That's what we know. Now, if you go like 2 generations before him, this was Sir John Hawkwood. He was one of the most famous condottieri of his era, and he was monogamous to Florence for 23 years. Mercenaries can't be loyal. They're loyal to the paycheck. They're not loyal to political factions, etc. Now, implications for leadership. First of all, in the future, and these are McFate's predictions, okay? In the future, we're going to see mercenaries increasingly seen as legitimate, and we'll see the stigma fade. That is already happening. If you talk to field grades or retirees in this room, I know there's a couple, we have a 2-star, yeah? I mean, if somebody told you 30 years ago that the US and the world would be hiring trigger pullers in a combat zone, would that seem incredible, or would that seem like that likely?
Well, I did it actually 4 years ago.
So. Okay, well, I'm not going to ask you. You got a ringer in here. Okay. Okay, but most people would have said, like, there's no way that the world's going to be, hiring mercenaries, et cetera. That's just, if it happens, it's going to be completely in the shadows. It's going to be sort of like wild geese or something. Also, that mercenaries can be a force for good or for evil. You might see a megachurch hiring mercenaries to do humanitarian interventions in an ISIS-like environment. Why not? Why not? Why do we assume they're evil? Because that's Hollywood telling us so? No, they're just think of them as an agent. The morality could be indeterminate. Mercenaries, we have a lot of evidence from this, from history. They can start and elongate wars for profit. In between contracts, they can become bandits and predators. They can engage in racketeering. So, for example, in the city of Siena in Italy, a small mercenary army would show up to this city, surround it, and say, give us 1,000 pounds of gold and pepper. Pepper was all the thing back then, by the way. 1,000 pounds of gold, or we're gonna sack you, and that's bad for your daughters. And so Siena runs around, and every piece of gold they can find, and they hand it all over to the mercenaries, and the mercenaries say, thank you, we'll be back next year. Okay? Happened a lot to Siena in particular. Regulating this industry, I am skeptical. Mercenaries, when you commodify conflict, it's the one commodity that resists law enforcement. The reason is because mercenaries can kill your law enforcement. I mean, who's going to go into Syria or Yemen and arrest all those mercenaries? The 82nd Airborne Division? No. UNDPKO? Of course not, right? If you can find them, who's going to arrest them? Now you could say, I'm gonna arrest their clients, like whoever hires them, but what if who's hired them is Russia or Nigeria or the UAE? What if it's a multinational company? What if it's like ExxonMobil? ExxonMobil gets its own army. You're going to really take on ExxonMobil? ExxonMobil has more power in the world than most states. So law enforcement is not the answer. And we're going to have to wait another generation or two for a Geneva Convention on this type of warrior. I don't think we're going to have it. In this world, too, the super rich can become a superpower. The papacy hired mercenaries a lot to do crusades. And the crusades were not in the Levant. They were in South France, for example. And strategy changes, and we'll end here. When you privatize warfare changes. Think of Clausewitz meets Adam Smith, one of the founders of economics. The problem is our general officer class, I teach at National Defense University, I run the strategy program at my college. We focus on Clausewitz, we don't focus on economics. And market strategies now apply to warfare when you marketize it. We are not ready for this. Here are some examples. I'm looking back at the early Renaissance, at at the Italian wars. There are historical examples for some of these strategies. And I'll let you read them because we're running out of time. And here's some for sellers. So forced buyers are those who hire mercenaries. Forced sellers are mercenaries. Warfare now changes. How war is prosecuted completely changes. It's marketized. Now CEOs are savvy to some of this, but our current 4-stars are not, because they were not raised on this, because they are raised in a World War II-like paradigm, right? And it's pretty scary. Let's not forget also that mercenaries do not want to work themselves out of business. It's another problem. So we must prepare for war as it is and not as we wish it. And that is the point of this book. With that, I'll turn to questions.
Yeah. Question about recruiting, because most of the trigger pullers now seem to come out of special forces and very highly skilled, highly trained groups. But that cadre of people is limited. And it seems to me that if you really wanted, if mercenaries, if armed contractors were going to expand to be really a major military player, they're going to have to bring in more people, maybe train them or bring in more of the regular infantry. Because when you look at a regular army, there's only a handful of those very skilled people, and most of them are 18-year-olds who have been through some basic training.
Yeah.
So does that put a cap on the market?
Well, okay, it's a great question. So we pay most attention to the ex-SOF guys because they're the sexiest, right? But a lot of the guys out there, and I've never seen a woman in the field, doesn't mean that there are no female mercenaries. I've just never seen one. A lot of them are infantry, 11 Bravo. They do more sort of the static security type of stuff, like oil line infrastructure, defense, and so forth. But they're definitely military. They're not sort of police. They're paramilitary. I will say this, is that when I was in industry, it's an illicit industry in many ways, so it's a word-of-mouth recruitment. And what that means for recruitment is that the industry is separated into language, command language group. So you have English speakers, like the NATO countries and others. You have the Russian speakers from the ex-Soviet type republics. You have the Latin American types from the, as we've seen here in Yemen. Those are the three big ones. We have smaller versions of this from France, Israel. Everybody's looking at China, because China has the largest domestic security population in the world, but that's just like, whack and hut in front of your mall. That's not it's not paramilitary. But it could be a game changer if they decided to do it. And there already is a Chinese mercenary company in South Sudan defending Chinese oil interests around Block 5A. They're getting hit by the Sudanese, the rebels there. And unlike the Russians who we've seen before, they don't really have combat experience. They're getting down chewed up, so I'm told. Yep.
You alluded to it. What are your objections to the Erik Prince plan in terms of
how much time do we have? No, I wish Erik was here, and Erik and I know each other and go back a ways and kind of go round and round. I mean, the bottom line is that 6,500 Joes ain't going to fix Afghanistan, right? I mean, 140,000 in 2011 couldn't do it, and that's when the Taliban was not rising like it is today. The Taliban controls more of Afghanistan than does the government. Now, I agree with him, and nobody's going to fight his assessment of the situation, that we're not efficient, that there are a lot of problems. Erik Prince does not get credit for identifying the problem. There's widespread agreement on the problem. His solution, though, is completely tactical. He wants to do training and equipping. Well, we got to raise a military and not just train and equip an existing one. So how do you create institutions of leadership? How do you create a Ministry of Defense and Interior that are not thoroughly corrupt as the culture is? I mean, there's a culture of corruption in Afghanistan. Putting guys at the company grade level for a year as mentors is, all that does is give you soldiers who shoot straighter and wear better uniforms. It doesn't create an ethos of a professional military ethos, which is actually, you know, there's no equivalent of this college in Afghanistan. His answer for how do you fight corruption, I asked him, how do you fight corruption? He's like, well, a smart guy with a clipboard in the motor pool can take care of that. I'm like, no, he can't. How do you create ministers of defense? I mean, look at what happened in North Iraq in 2014 when ISIS was taking it over, and they took over Mosul. You know how much effort the U.S. military put into training the military of Mosul? A small terrorist force takes over, and the army there throws off their uniform and flees. And the reason they flee is not because they didn't have good training and equipment. They had all that. They had mentorship. It's because Baghdad put idiots who are their generals, who are political cronies and not real leaders, no patents there. And as soon as they saw the Toyota Hiluxes come over the berm, they got in their helicopters and they fled. So the leadership problem, and lastly, is when you create new armies, how many years does it take to create a colonel in most armies? How many years does it take? Ask our cadets. 20 years, right? Well, if you create a new army out of scratch, you have an army of privates, right? So there's a lot of operational reasons. And also, we would never put a soldier on the street here or a policeman without a background check. You can't do that in Afghanistan. There's no way to do a thorough background check. There are so many operational problems that I just can't imagine what he's going to do. And lastly, he wants to do Title 50 authorities, which is CIA, which is problematic on several levels. I mean, I'm sorry, I could rant all day. But some of the ideas, though, are not wrong. I mean, not everything Eric says is wrong, and I think the idea of a privatized solution of some sort or another, a hybrid version, should be considered if we want to stay there. Yeah. Well, that's for Bourbon. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, that's me now. Hi.
Yes.
Terrific presentation.
Thank
you very much. You compare, the cycles between the conventional, force and the mercenaries. And for conventional, it's between war and peace. And when there's no war, there's peace.
Right.
The conventional force still, has all the privileges and the fundings and
Yeah.
the aircraft and all that. So one would say, somewhat cynically, conventional force is interested in peace, but be funded for war, right? So for mercenaries, you're talking about a different cycle. It's work or no work. So if we go down that path, do you think that instead of a durable disorder, we'll get a permanent war situation, or Leon Trotsky's formula of no peace? Is there a danger for international order and stability going down that path?
Well, first of all, as you'll see on Rule 3 here, is that I think there's no such thing as war and peace. And what we see is that there are powers like China who leverage the space, our imagined space between war and peace, for victory. That's what they do in the South China Sea. They go right up to the edge of war and then stop, and we freak out, but they keep what they got, right? That's a strategy. And they're exploiting it because we have an old-fashioned notion of war and peace. Now, here's what the problem with mercenaries is that they're on a market cycle, not an international politics cycle. And yes, we saw in the Italian wars, for example, again, sometimes going to the more extreme cases show us what the phenomenon is. It lays it bare the most. There was perpetual war. And this is not high-intensity conflict, but it's the low-intensity, persistent, never-ending wars that we're already kind of seeing today in Iraq and other places like that. This would only intensify it. And my concern about mercenaries, and this is a leadership issue for our future leaders, is that we have a burgeoning industry. Nobody's really trying to stop it or control it. What happens when you take an industry vested in conflict and put it in the most conflict-prone continent on Earth? You have more war, more suffering, and this should worry us all because it destabilizes everything. It may not destabilize the United States or New Zealand, but destabilizes regions and allies we care deeply about. Yes, sir. One over here.
Two different connected questions.
Okay.
two different connected questions. Comment on the funding for PMCs, not necessarily state funding.
Yeah.
That's part one. Part two, Wagner Group is supposedly incorporated in Buenos Aires. Talk for a second about the future of Wagner Group.
Well, so tracing the money is, it's sort of like the narco world or illicit. I mean, Moises Naim wrote this great book a couple years ago called Illicit. And it's like, how do you trace the money? And I totally think we should take lessons from narco researchers, if that's even a term, and apply it to this industry. Because there's shell things, and the Panama Papers revealed some of this, and we shouldn't be worried about the state funders. It's the non-state ones that worry me most. The Fortune 500 is more powerful than most states today. There's 190 some states, depending on who you count. The vast majority, when Exxon again shows up to the shores of the Gabon, are they really always in charge because there's a state? No, of course not. So we should all be worried. And I'm not saying ExxonMobil is going to get a private army, at least not yet. But why not? What happens when an oligarch or a random billionaire wants to seal a legacy by ending a genocide with swiping a check, right? Well, that's fine if it works, but what about war's number one rule, which is not on here, doesn't need to be, is unintended consequences, right? So I agree with you, but I don't have an answer for that. I'm not like a narco, I'm not, or terrorist financing, but we still were not able to crack terrorist financing 100%. The second for Wagner Group, I don't know. I mean, Wagner Group is really fascinating to me. I think we have to be careful about separating noise from signal on the Wagner Group in terms of Western analysts. I have Russian analysts who also track this. I mean, basically, it's seen as sort of a GRU type of extension. But for how long and what happens? And we assume they're all Russians in the Wagner or Wagner Group. It's not. Why would we assume that, right? The problem, I see a lot of amateur analysts looking at this, assuming it's just some sort of cheap proxy Spetsnaz thing. It's not. It's a completely different animal. And we have to think about it in terms of a market actor rather than just like a proxy militia like the Donbass Battalion. So, in terms of Brazil, Brazil's, they're making geopolitical plays right now. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Question about rule number one.
Yes, sir.
Is conventional war and unconventional war, are they in fact mutually exclusive? Don't we need both capabilities?
So it's a great question, and thank you for asking that. This presentation was not on rule number one, but the first thing I would say is that there's no such thing as conventional or unconventional war. There's just war. The spectrum of conflict includes everything, and it's not like you cross a certain threshold. You go from conventional to unconventional. You can do them in tandem, in parallel. You can do bits of one and bits of another. There's one of your colleagues, I think too, is Hoffman, right? Frank Hoffman, who was one of the originators of the idea of hybrid war, which I think has merit, but I disagree with for other reasons. But it looks at this very composition. And by the way, he was the primary pen holder of the new national defense strategy. Okay. Here's my only issue with conventional war is that when people think of great power competition between, say, the US and China, why do we assume it's going to be conventional? Why do we assume that? Why do we assume that that's the World War II paradigm I'm talking about? If you could argue we're already at war with China. We just don't know it. You could argue, was the Cold War really a war, or was it a metaphor? You could say the same today about China or Russia. You could say that a lot right now, it's not just China, Russia, it's also India, Pakistan, Algeria, Morocco, it's all over the world. So when I'm saying conventional war is dead, it's provocative to make us rethink what constitutes war and warfare today. So yes, I do. The question is also that when it comes down to like budget, what do you buy? It gets to be serious when aircraft carriers cost $13 billion a piece before you add aircraft and people. So it's consequential for military planning. Yes. All right. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you.
Sean, I have a little something for you. Very, very interesting presentation. And you better watch out. We're going to get you back.
Thank you.
Sometime.
Thank you very much.
But
It's a
here's
privilege.
a small gift for you.
Thank you very much.
And,
Thanks,
thanks
Billy.
again for a great presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
And don't forget, Sean's book is on the table back here.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you.
Limited copies, so you better get over.
Okay, so we need everybody back in their seats at 11 o'clock. It's 10:45. Thank you. Okay, let's take our seats here and we'll get started in 30 seconds.
So it's my honor to introduce our moderator for the last panel session of this symposium, Dr. Tony Pfaff. He is the research professor for the military profession and ethic at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, a retired Army colonel. Dr. Pfaff recently served as director for Iraq on the National Security Council staff. While on active duty, he served on the policy planning staff of the State Department, as the defense attaché in Baghdad, the chief of international military affairs for U.S. Army Central Command, and as the defense attaché in Kuwait. He served twice in Operation Iraqi Freedom, once as the deputy J2 for a Joint Special Operations Task Force, and as the senior military advisor for the Civilian Police Assistance Training Team. He also served as the senior intelligence officer on the Iraq Intelligence Task Force and as a UN observer along the Iraq-Kuwait border. Dr. Pfaff has a bachelor's degree in philosophy and economics from Washington and Lee University, a master's degree in philosophy from Stanford University, a master's in national resource management from the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, and a doctorate in philosophy from Georgetown University.
Well, thank you, Eddie. I think we're in for a treat today. This is the last panel, so time limits go out the window. Just kidding. But this is going to be a very wide-ranging discussion. We've got J.D. Work, who's going to talk about some more interesting information on the Wagner Group, particularly as it pertains to cyber operations. We've got Dr. Mienie, Dr. Payne, and Brad Regeski, who are going to talk about PMCs in the context of hybrid warfare. And then CAPT Michael Ju, who is going to talk about the challenges that arise when private military contractors get captured by the enemy. What do we do and how do we respond? So it's going to be, I think, a very interesting, wide-ranging conversation. And with no further ado, I am going to get it started. So, Mr. Work.
Hello, folks. Thank you very much. Very glad you could join us today. And we know we're wrapping up the day, but always a pleasure to be here. Quick disclaimer, as always, all views are my own, and any errors and omissions are attributable solely to myself. This is an unclassified presentation. We will mention some things that are drawn from industry reporting that are very current and very timely, but this is definitely not U.S. government information in any sense. And this is also very much an academic discussion. With those disclaimers out of the way, we wanted today to talk about the unique emerging role of the private military contractor within non-Western usage. This has been a challenging subject we've touched upon many times over the past few days. The visibility into this instrument, the scope of access to understand how our adversaries think about this tool and how they both currently employ and shall employ this tool in future operations is, of course, not the easiest of subjects for academic analysis. As a result, we're looking for some observables which are not the usual scope of study and discourse. And particularly in this area, we're looking to some of the aspects of the cyber operations problems that may illuminate this. This creates a unique intersection of challenges in study and analysis that we'll talk about at several points. But I wanted to caveat that coming into the discussion that this is one of the most emerging fields, and it is at the collision of several edges of those fields. So this is very much a preliminary view from which we can draw only initial and preliminary findings. I will say over the past day we have examined some of the utility in other contexts for why the private military contractor or the mercenary has come back into state practice as an instrument, as a proxy, as a mechanism of plausible or implausible deniability, however we wish to see this. And just as we wish to avoid the political cost of casualties, there is a long-standing belief within the Russian system that the soldiers' mothers' protests of the Soviet era in Afghanistan were among the most damaging aspects of the dissolution of the Soviet Empire. So there's a great intent to avoid the reappearance of the zinc coffin as a prominent political feature in Moscow life, both through the use of the mercenaries and something we won't talk about today, but we have seen adversary cyber operations targeting these protest groups, targeting dissidents that would organize protest to war activity and attempting to suppress that activity and other mechanisms. Based on industry reporting, that we have had this visibility. Having said that, we are looking more at the non-official instrument, the private military contractor instrument in this case. There is a long tradition of incorporating contractors in various guises within the Russian armed forces, irregular formations that have been granted certain utility and certain freedoms that are given a range of independence of command, a range of independence of logistics, and are therefore a auxiliary and deniable instrument in some cases. The degree to which these have been incorporated and legitimized over the years as the attempt to centralize control within the Soviet Union became a factor has obscured some of their origins. But there is actually a long memory among these formations, among those that would seek to revive these formations. The uses of this history have found new resonance within the contemporary audience. The threads of this history are also closely intertwined with what one of our colleagues has previously referred to as the nature of the violent market actor. The idea that there are folks that can understand and can pursue profit objectives, pursue their own independent positioning within state power structures through their ability to command force and other military resources. So when we wind the threads of this ideation into a contemporary strategic posture, we wind up with a very unique and hybrid creature indeed. We have seen this emerge strongly during the period of the Balkans conflict. We saw reporting of some of this action in Georgia, and of course we've seen it in full flower today. What makes it very uniquely interesting to track this phenomenon at this period of time is the discussion of the revolution in intelligence affairs that is occurring contemporaneously to the scope of this problem. There is now better open source information, better quality of tracking, better quality of insight into previously denied areas and previously hard target problems than at any point previously in history. And this is actually a very narrow cast stream of information. That is, it is specific to certain audiences, is specific to certain producers, and allows for a very different kind of quality of discussion as a result of this. We are now watching cases where we can track troops in contact. We can develop entire order of battle estimates solely from the open source for some of these adversary engagements. I will note there is a methodological problem created by some of these some of this reporting, in that other intelligence services for different parties to the conflicts have a vested interest in making sure some of this information is widely known. That does create a certain degree of distortion and potential influence effects within these reporting streams. However, to date, we have been fortunate in that that distortion has been rather unsubtle. Those distortion factors tend to be very predictable, and we can therefore control for them in a slightly different manner than with a more sophisticated pattern of disinformation. When it comes to the reactions of various parties within the conflict, it's also important to note that while this idea of committing irregular forces, first described as Cossacks, self-described by some of the forces committed to the Ukraine as Cossacks, Russian contractors' presence has not gone unnoticed. A lot of folks have tracked this, a lot of folks have reacted to this. One of the strongest elements of utility in the cyber operations instrument is its ability to rapidly deliver effects based on that degree of attention. The quality of those effects, the sophistication of those effects during the early periods of the Ukraine conflict in 2014 are, however, debatable. But it was what we would assess as an early example of an attempt to create a deep strike against the logistics lines supporting the irregular forces operating in the Ukraine in that period. There were several relief convoys, alleged humanitarian convoys, described as such by the Russian government, which provided military assistance as well as other logistic supplies to the irregular forces fighting in occupied territories. These forces were, these convoys were acknowledged to have been organized at several locations within the interior of Russia. They were widely promoted, and there was a large media and information operations effect to promote these movements, to publicize these movements as they entered Ukraine. Concurrent to this, industry reporting indicated that there were several distributed denial of service attacks executed against the local government and media organs involved in promoting these convoys. Again, the utility of this in stopping these convoys was marginal. The indications of the intent for that instrument, however, to our view, is much more significant. Interestingly enough, this also created a very baffling challenge for us, in that a number of the sources of medical supply were were taken from what appeared to be otherwise legitimate medical institutions throughout the former Soviet near abroad. In one case, we saw a distributed denial of service attack executed against a Belarusian hospital, which may have been involved in some of these medical supply diversions. It's not clear that the hospital had any knowledge of these diversions. However, the timing of the attack, the consistency of the attack, was closely correlated to the attack on the Cossack elements. This poses interesting challenges, both in terms of law of armed conflict implications, as well as the extension of cyber operations constructs within the humanitarian debate. In this case, a DDoS of this nature was very likely de minimis, but this does not excuse deliberate targeting intent and is therefore quite problematic. We will note that this convoy problem continues to sustain irregular forces within occupied territories of the Ukraine throughout 2018. And as a side note for this conference, it is interesting to note that a tremendous amount of the tracking data we have on these convoys comes from UAV systems operated also by contractors on behalf of OSCE. And we have seen attacks against these contractors through electronic warfare and other means in order to deny drone overflight coverage. When we look at the expansion of private military company operations, of course, we look to Wagner in Syria. This is where the escalation of these events, particularly as Western forces are maneuvering in proximity, become an area of concern. We can debate what this incident in Syria was meant to be for the Russian forces, strategic concept, whether this was adventurism, whether this was reach beyond grasp, whether this was an attempt to test Western resolve and therefore requires a certain measure of signaling response. At the end of the day, there were a tremendous number of casualties reported among the Russian irregular forces engaged in this area. We've talked about this in other sessions. I won't go too much more into detail. I will note, however, this was an extremely well-documented event with very public descriptions within a very short period of time after the kinetic engagements. This is rather unusual for the nature of the forces in question. However, anytime you have U.S. Conventional and special operations forces having to engage irregulars, trained, equipped, and in some cases directly attributable to Russian military elements, you begin to understand the nature of this event as a substantial signaling concern. This engagement did come after a period of increasingly poor morale among Russian contractors, complaints over equipment, things that are not unfamiliar to any Western contractor that has been operating in the Middle East. But it was the first time we'd seen Russian elements go through this learning curve. This will have implications for future force deployments, as the smarter mercenaries will learn from these behaviors. I will also note one side element of signaling. When you look at the complex information environment of today, the discussion of Wagner in U.S. military circles has a longer standing tradition than the Russian mercenary component, particularly based on graffiti commonly found in certain military installations. That discussion and some of the symbology around that discussion is easily misinterpreted by Russian actors on the internet who really didn't understand the context for some of those images and some of the implications of those images. It has created interesting discussions among Russian nationals, particularly those engaged in cyber operations. We also say this incident in particular gives us insight into a very complicated signals intelligence environment. The tactical radio intercepts reported from the Wagner units under fire and immediately after the period of fire revealed the existence of a capability which was easily theorized but not directly confirmed. We have seen concurrent similar capabilities deployed in the theater, including a Russian facility that was in operation for quite an extended period of time before it was overrun by anti-government forces and publicized. We've also seen near real-time track of U.S. signals intelligence assets on UAV platforms that presumably could generate some additional capability in this area. This is a complicated spectrum. It's a complicated environment. And we understand that there are engagements occurring routinely in the electromagnetic spectrum between these capabilities. These are entirely not yet described in the public literature. There are some journalist reporting items which mention this, but this is an otherwise unexamined aspect of the conflict, and particularly the PMC role in this conflict, and the potential for the utility of these elements within Russian PMC forces is therefore still somewhat opaque to us and deserves further attention. However, when we talk about how these forces have come to be, particularly the Russian versions of the PMC, the common discussion has been that this is a dark reflection of U.S. practice, that this is somehow an anti-Blackwater, somehow the mirror image of U.S. PMC deployment practices. I do believe that there is some credence to that argument, but not perhaps in the way that it is commonly asserted. We understand that a number of the U.S. private military contractors have been repeatedly targeted for more than a decade by Russian-attributed cyber operations, conducting intrusions against our systems and network for the purpose of espionage. This reporting has an extensive pedigree of industry tracking, particularly across a number of named intrusion sets. I will not, for this audience, go into the distinctions and details of the various Russian intrusion sets. You may have heard of several of these, including APT-28, Fancy Bear, or Iron Twilight, in connection with several intrusions against high-profile U.S. targets. We will note particularly that the entity commonly tracked by industry as Sandworm or Voodoo Bear or Electrum has been attributed for responsibility in cases of other intrusions in the Ukraine. The significance of these intrusion sets were the use of commodity malware in many cases, malware which is drawn from the criminal underground marketplace and redeployed against multiple targets. This pattern of activity compromised a prominent U.S. private military contractor as early as late 2008 and was used to pivot across multiple individuals on an unclassified mailing list associated with that contractor. We've subsequently seen targeting of server infrastructure used to host certain operational planning and logistics details for other PMCs. This has given the Russian intelligence service operators behind these intrusion sets incredible insight into U.S. PMC operations and organization, as well as some otherwise non-publicized factors So the idea that there's a dark reflection is one that must be modified by a view of the eternal question of smoke and mirrors of the espionage game.
Okay, 1 minute, please.
Thank you. We do look to see continuing intrusion across multiple requirement sets, which have shown other access of great interest. I won't dive into the other intrusion sets at any length here, especially given time limitations. I will note, however, interestingly enough, these intrusion sets were not solely targeted at Western interests, but additionally, we saw intrusions directed against Russian paramilitary elements, including private military contractors. The existence of these intrusions raises a very difficult question. The idea of whether or not these intrusions were part of a core espionage mission for the intelligence service operators responsible for these intrusions, whether these were simply transitive access targets, that is, particularly for elements of the Russian private military contracting forces, which provided maritime security to Western energy firms. Was this merely an adjunct to other intrusion activity targeting the energy companies themselves for other strategic value, of which there is a substantial body of industry reporting tracing those requirements and the utility of those intrusions? However, we also identify a potential military counterintelligence mission, tracking exactly what concerns the state may have regarding the elements of the PMCs in question, or potentially also provocatively leveraging state resources for for anti-competitive purposes to advance one favored contractor over other competitors in the marketplace. I believe that there is a mix of all of these elements that we may see here, but parsing these is actually quite the challenge. I shan't get into too much of the nature of that parsing, but we will say this is part of the general question of indistinguishability that emerges in any case that we are tracking cyber operations activity, particularly where there's potential offensive value in an intrusion access beyond mere espionage. This indistinguishability is part of what Robert Jervis has termed his security dilemma, and that my colleague Jay Healy and he and some other folks have done some interesting work on. I'll refer you to their work. With that, I will simply say it is possible, therefore, when we observe these intrusions, that we see in this activity machinations between elements of the power structure and a very unique lens on how this power structures begin to position within the framework of the Russian strategic system, particularly to advance personal interests, particularly given other ongoing debates regarding deployment in Africa and changes to the Russian Federation's legal code governing aspects of operations in private military contracting sphere. With that, I will beg your forbearance for running slightly over time and cede the floor.
All right, thank you very much. That was a fascinating presentation. And next up is Dr. Mienie and team, and Dr. Bryson.
Thank you. If you'll allow us the privilege of remaining seated for this portion so that we don't have to shuffle back and forth across the three of us, we're going to give this presentation as a trio. First of all, thank you very much to the conference organizers. This has been a tremendous symposium. It's an honor to be a part of it, especially with the level of discussion and the terrific questions that have come about. The discussion's been a wonderful part of this event. Thank you also to our moderator, to our fellow panelists, and thank you to all of you for staying for the last session. We are especially grateful to be able to be a part of this symposium this year. I'll share just a brief overview of our presentation today. We're going to give an introduction, talk about national security from a human perspective, and then discuss specifically outsourcing and PMSCs with a special case study on outsourcing in cybersecurity, and talk about a few organizations in particular. And then finish up with some recommendations and conclusions, and we're interested to hear questions and feedback on this research, as part of it is ongoing. First of all, private military and security companies have become increasingly relied upon by nation-states to support military operations and protection of life and property, as we've discussed throughout this symposium. But the question has come up numerous times in the literature and in our own research, whether for-profit PMSCs are contributing more to national security or to state fragility. We've discussed a number of those elements, and we want to try to bring those together and synthesize those in this next to last paper. We have one particular case study on cyber operations and hybrid conflict. I believe we've heard unanimous agreement that we are engaged in hybrid conflict. And that presents significant challenges, especially for smaller states, but there are challenges for the larger nations engaged in hybrid conflict as well. And while PMSCs can bolster military intelligence and security forces, the wholesale outsourcing of specialized tasks, especially core roles, could contribute to a lack of nation-state capabilities. With that, I'll hand it to my colleague, Dr. Mienie.
Thank you. So the sustained increase in the number of private security and military companies employed by governments around the world to provide force augmentation during periods of conflict has transformed into an apparent reliance on private contractors for continuing support, as the notion of hybrid conflict has expanded to include use of deception, information warfare, and cyber warfare as a sustained force short of war by both state and non-state actors. We use the human security theoretical framework for our paper, and we distinguish between a state-centered and a human-centered approach to security. So the components of human security are all interdependent: crime, famine, pollution, terrorism, drug trafficking, ethnic disputes, and social disintegration. And it's easier to ensure security through early prevention than later intervention. We, in our paper, focus on people-centered answers to the questions of whose security, security from what, and security by what means. We looked at 3 schools, and we use only the broad school, as it uses a holistic approach concerning human development in general. We propose that security functions of the state should be discussed within the context of the human security debate. And as mentioned yesterday, human security is not a defensive concept, but it's an integrative one. And this acknowledges the universalism of life claims and is based on solidarity among people and can happen when there is consensus that development must involve all people. We look at the 7 components of human security as listed there: personal, community, economic, political, health, food, and environment. And all of these are at risk of cyber attacks. The lines between the private security, private intelligence, and private military have become vague and blurred. The private security industry is increasingly performing functions that used to be the sole preserve of the state. So private security is definitely diversified. As far as outsourcing is concerned, there may be sound economic reasons for the state to outsource security functions, in which case it could contribute to stability, which is an advantage. However, the state should consider which security functions are core and decide which of those, if any, should be outsourced. Outsourcing to private security companies assumes effective management, transparency, and accountability of the PSCs. When this is not present, the state loses control over those activities of the private security companies. The private security industry's primary role as that of protecting its clients and their assets versus the state's role of crime prevention and combating crime is a complicating factor. Governments should not be in the business of reacting to a crime after it has taken place and been reported, but in crime prevention. And that's why we say outsourcing is a complicated factor. When core security functions are outsourced because of the loss of state security capacity and capability, our paper suggests that we can no longer speak of outsourcing, as it is now morphed into insourcing. At this point, the state begins to lose some control over its core security functions, which are now in the hands of the private security industry. So we see there's an encroachment upon the jurisdiction of national security agencies. And then, of course, we also submit that where a nation state has a constitution, a government should meet the expectations that its constitution stipulates.
All right. Hi there. I want to thank everybody for coming on this rainy day. My name is Brad Regeski, and I'm going to present the case study today about the offensive intrusion and monitoring industry in regards to private military corporations and their operations. Now, most of what I'm going to be discussing about today is with Mienie's relational aspect, where he was talking about the blurring of crime prevention and interception. Now, these military companies that I'm going to discuss about today actually operate where they develop and they test monitoring intrusion tools. So basically, they outsource, governments would outsource these technologies to these third-party companies, and they would develop these tools to help monitor mass surveillance citizens and also intercept crimes before they happen. Now, the development of a cyber arsenal that I describe here in the slides is not the same thing as a nation-state arsenal of cyber operations, another topic entirely. What I'm more talking about, again, is private surveillance and militaries in the age of surveillance. Now, we were talking about hybrid conflict before and how private military corporations are expanding into the zone, but it's a more complicating factor where you don't have a nation-state for hire. More often, these private companies that are operating in a cyber age are trying to supply the nation-states with the necessary tools to engage in cyber warfare on a massive scale. And of course, they're operating for profit. Now, the positive outcome of the innovation with respect to the development of monitoring tools is the primary factor of why these private military corporations in cyberspace are so profitable and so effective. Now, on the impact of the broad holistic view of security, as Mienie suggested, the positive use is it's a monitoring intrusion tool that will help intercept potential terrorist attacks, and instead of responding to them, intercept before the actual crime occurs. But of course, the negative to these underlying views of security is these companies are working on helping potentially repressive governments monitor their citizens and breach their privacy, which is another topic altogether of how a government should or if they should breach their privacy in order to ensure a citizen's protection. But before I go more into that, I want to relate actually the growth of a usual private military security company in the age of cyber. Now, most of these companies actually related in Europe with relaxed technical standards in regards to cyber operations for companies in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. But mostly what these companies would do is they would take popular intrusion tools that were open source and commercialize them and make it so it's easily mass marketable and usable for governments to use in order to spy on citizens. After that, they would go to small contracts like police forces or small municipal governments, and they would sell these tools to help spy on citizens and prevent crimes before they happened. After that, they would vend to a vertical or they would actually supply vertically, so they would go up the government chain of sorts until they reach all the way to intelligence agencies and military forces for occupation forces. After that, they would need to increase their profit margins, so they would go actually international. So they would box these basic intrusion tools and monitoring agencies and would go across the globe to places like Saudi Arabia or the United States as well, anywhere in Europe, Uganda, just about anywhere that would be any kind of developing nation that would need a effective monitoring and mass surveillance tool. And then the two light blue slides are the only two eventualities that these companies can do, either continue profit or security incidents violating citizen privacy and security that also help to violate the mass surveillance framework of the nation. All right. So what I was going to talk about with these next couple of slides is actually the duality of the for-profit monitoring industry. So again, their primary motivation is the development of criminal interception, technical innovation tools, and of course, profit. But the potential negative effect of outsourcing source code to private companies for nation states is, of course, you build this reliable framework for your surveillance industry, but of course, it's all built on a private company that, of course, can be leaked, can be breached, and it's just another access point for a hacker to use to come inside and then violate your mass surveillance framework. All right, so the first company I'm going to talk about today, actually, with all these private military companies, I'm not saying I'm condemning these companies for what has happened, but I'm more saying what has happened in the past with these private security companies, and of course, how this violates or the citizens' privacy and the surveillance framework of the nation state. So the first one I want to talk about today is Hacking Team. Now, Hacking Team was a Milan-based organization back in the early 1990s. It is one of the largest in the world in terms of negotiated contracts. Now, give me one second. All right. So on July 15, 2015, the official Twitter account was compromised and the internal company network. So that means a 400 gigabyte file of company invoices, source code, and transactions was listed upon WikiLeaks. Now, they said they compromised the network in under 5 minutes, but I tend to disagree. Now, this, of course, could be, I don't know, boasted, but supposedly it was the insecurity of this actual network was pretty relaxed. But the 400 gigabyte file listed almost every contract that was listed and the source code. So again, when we release the source code online, of course, any kind of nation state framework that uses this source code, of course, now is completely vulnerable to be for any terrorist or citizen to be masked or used against them in a sort of way. Now, it's currently operating today, and it's vending to multiple countries, including the United States, and also to small universities across in the Western United States. They also market towards police forces, and they also develop the software used in stingrays, which is a controversial practice of masking cell phone towers and then intercepting the technology or intercepting the traffic in the stream. Now, they currently also vend towards Saudi Arabia and directly market towards Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who is currently implicated in the killing of journalist James Khashoggi. The next company I want to talk about is FinFisher, which is actually Gamer Group, but their FinFisher software is a very popular software used today, all right? Now, the widely popular FinFisher tool can actually violate most cell phones used today and can intercept all calls, text messages, contact lists, photos, and browsing history on the phone. And is still effective and still on the market today, and I think you can buy a copy for about $120 a slice. Now, according in 2013, Mozilla released a legal cease and desist order for the company of Gamer Group. And it was because of a Gamer Group found publicly released or publicly inserted their FinFisher software into the Mozilla Firefox browser program. And they never publicly confirmed nor denied the use of the software. But after the cease and desist order was delivered, magically, there was never found again. So. And then two other notable profiles I want to talk about was Digitask, which was the Cologne customs incident in 1999. Now, Digitask was a German-based private monitoring and software industry developer, but unfortunately, the CEO and founder of Digitask bribed the Cologne government with 130 million euros and was actually caught and was sent to prison for 25 years. Now, the government actually absorbed Digitask as a government training IT platform, and they're still currently operating today as well. And the last one I want to talk about today is actually Citizen Labs, which is the University of Toronto-based Internet rights watchdog. And they're hosting the 400 gigabyte Hacking Team leak with commentary. Now, I suggest after the conference, if you guys want to check that out, they list the entire company invoice and emails of all the software. And it's a really good read, and it's a rare opportunity to look inside the PMSCs. Now, I wanted to relate all these incidences with these hacking teams because, again, with hybrid conflict and nation-state stability, linking these companies and these incidences, you undermine the state fragility that you have. So again, leaking the source code and leaking all this software, you undermine your mass surveillance program and you help to undermine potential criminal interception. But I'm trying not to be so negative against the private military security companies in the age of cyber because I understand that adversaries' rising use of end-to-end technology and encryption tools makes it harder for governments to stop and catch potential terrorists and crimes before they happen. And I know that physical information, or with the market, how innovation happens is, of course, through the market. So using that, governments should rely on outsourcing their technologies in order to continue to innovate and find better tools to help intercept agencies. What else is there? So I neither condemn nor favor these industries, but I'm just saying the more incident securities happen, the more we undermine our mass surveillance industry across for nation-state fragility. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Payne. Thank you so much.
There we go. Just to tie everything together, we know that private military and security organizations are likely here to stay. But private for-profit PMSCs may be contributing in some cases to state fragility, especially for smaller nations, but with certain applications, as we've discussed earlier in the symposium, even for larger nations. PMSCs are being used by nations and by non-state actors in traditional and especially in cyber and hybrid conflict. And while they can bolster military, intelligence, and security forces, we have to guard against the wholesale outsourcing of highly specialized roles because that can contribute not only to a lack of nation-state capabilities, but it can destabilize smaller states. Smaller states especially may be susceptible to instability from PMSCs employed by larger nations and non-state actors and collateral damage. And we've already heard mention during the symposium here that the perceived higher pay, notwithstanding the lack of job security, pension, medical, and other benefits of contractors, can lead to, first, an animosity between PMSCs and government military intelligence and security forces, but also to the brain drain that we've discussed a couple of times already. Soldiers, officers, agents, police, etc. may be tempted by the perceived increase of 2 times, 3 times, or higher salary to do similar work as private contractors without considering those overall and long-term consequences. And we've noted that some in the literature have advocated for outsourcing of non-core functions or specializations that are too expensive for a government to maintain itself. However, some high-cost specializations, such as offensive cyber ops, may also fall under force short of war or warfare, usually only exercised by governments. One possible solution is the embedding and cross-training of national forces with PMSCs, as others have brought forth as a possibility, because that would give us the benefits of outsourcing without as serious a brain drain and with potentially greater sustainability as nations train up as they work alongside PMSCs instead of the black box model. And then training and education of our next generation of military, intelligence, and security officers is critical for nation states, large and small. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you very much. And now, Michael, over to you. There's your clicker.
So, there are some benefits to being last. There's the occasional drawback to being last. I'm going to try and stay seated here and click from here and kind of have more of a conversation about and tell you 2 stories about other things that happen with PMCs, with contractors, and bring it down from the nation state or the corporation and more to the individual level. Now, we've had a lot of numbers the last couple of days. A lot of these were covered already, so I thank Sean and Eric and Molly and Laura for covering some of these details, so I get to click right through some of these. But there's some numbers that we didn't really talk about. So while there's more contractors out there, the likelihood of anyone in war dying has gone down dramatically. In World War II, in Korea and Vietnam, about a 2% chance of an individual service member dying. The first Gulf War, 0.03%. And now in Iraq and Afghanistan, even with the death of about 7,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, looking at 0.3%. That 7,000 is roughly the same number as casualties on one day, the first day of D-Day in World War II. Now, that's a perspective we tend to lose out on. But here's another number, or set of numbers that we haven't really looked at either. And that's the number of captives. In World War II, there were 120,000 Americans that were captured, 30,000 in the Pacific, 94,000 in Europe. In Korea, the number was 7,000. In Vietnam, just over 700. In the first Gulf War, 23. And since 9/11, about a dozen. About 50 contractors, 50 American contractors have also been captured. Very few of those have come home. So as we talk about contractors, and we know that this isn't exactly who we think of, but it's not really who we're talking about. We're talking more about these guys. We're talking about the construction workers, the folks that fuel the tankers, the trucks, the folks that fuel helicopters, the guys that serve in the DFAC. We know that statistically, and Mark had a slide like this, and Molly had a slide like this as well, the guys that are pulling the triggers, the guys that are armed, are a small, very small portion of them. But for all of them, they're legally in a really weird place. They are, Laura covered this in great detail yesterday. There's a lot of laws, a lot of jurisdictions, and it's a smorgasbord for the governments and for the contracting organizations, and it's famine for the individual. Laura really reinforced yesterday that every bit of law out there is to protect the corporation, to protect the government, and it's not there to protect the individual. And that's what I really want to talk about, is about the individuals. So the guy I want to talk about now is Roy Hallams, who in November of 2004 is a retired naval officer working for the Saudi Arabian Trading and Construction Company in Baghdad. And masked gunmen break into his office, drag him out, make him lie on the floor, and it turns out that there were 20 folks that broke into the office. They kidnapped a half dozen people that day. Everyone was released within a couple weeks or months, except for Roy, and he was held for almost a year. He's 56. He's a retired Supply Corps officer from the Navy and had just recently divorced his wife of 30 years. He'd worked in Saudi Arabia for various companies from the mid-1990s until he was captured in 2004. And it was like Carolyn Baca told us yesterday, and it was good money. And he was banking good money, and it was generally safe. Within 4 hours of his kidnapping, the State Department notified first his sister, because he was divorced, then one of his daughters, and then about 9 p.m. on the West Coast, many hours after he was originally taken, his ex-wife received official notification, but this was from the FBI. The kidnapping in Iraq in the early 2000s had political consequences, and the Philippines pulled troops out in order to save a hostage. Arab diplomatic missions, including Pakistan, Bahrain, Sudan, and Egypt, recalled envoys from Baghdad after embassy staff members were kidnapped, and upwards of $45 million were paid in ransoms. These concessions didn't do much to slow down the kidnappings. If anything, they expanded and fueled them, and the money was rolled into financing more kidnappings and financing the insurgent attacks. By one account, over the course of 3 years, anywhere between 10 and 30 Iraqi citizens were kidnapped every single day for 3 years. That's an incredible, incredible number. And there were a lot of kidnappings, but there were very, very few Americans that were kidnapped. But I'm an American, and I'm comparing American cases, so we're going to talk about it from the American point of view. When an American's kidnapped or held by somebody overseas in a war zone, but they're not military, and they're American, as a military retiree, who's in charge? Well, if it's a military member, the military is in charge. There's not much question about that. If it was in the U.S., regardless of who, then the FBI is in charge. But if you're overseas, specifically in Iraq at this point, who gets that unwanted tasker? Well, in this case, it was the American Embassy, who is neither trained or equipped to handle the problem. And while state had the bullseye for this, the FBI and the military both had a major impact on someone who wasn't there working with or for them. If you look back to the notifications, it was a combination of the State Department and the FBI notifying the family members. And then when the FBI made their notifications, they had two specific comments that they added. One, they didn't want any media attention during the first few months or the first few weeks originally of the ordeal. They were afraid it might interfere with negotiations. And they also offered ongoing counseling to the family. The request to stay out of the media with the family lasted about 6 weeks, and I think that was pretty generous on the part of the family. The counseling that was offered never materialized. Roy Hallams was held for 311 days, and generally in small spaces with his hands bound, face covered, was often gagged. He was allowed to use the bathroom twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening. And when he was moved, he was always bound, gagged, hooded, and typically placed in a car trunk, often with another kidnapped victim, a Filipino that he traveled with on a regular basis who was taken the same day as him, and a trunk full of tools. So it wasn't even comfortable as he was traveling in that trunk. Over those 311 days, the Saudi Arabia Trading and Construction Company kept paying him. His daughter's names were on his account so they could handle his finances, and Carrie and Susan, one of his daughters and his ex-wife, made their first network appearance on Good Morning America on December 19th. Speaking in public took the place of that offered counseling. They formed a foundation, the Free Roy Foundation. They held a candlelight vigil to mark his 57th birthday and did what they could to feel useful in an area where they didn't at all feel useful. Good Morning America was followed by CNN, contact with bloggers, and stories in local and national press. And eventually they met with Dianne Feinstein, Jesse Jackson, and Paul Azan, all of whom promised to help in some way. In the end, Roy Hallams was rescued largely because the French negotiated the release of a journalist named Florence Aubenas, and her debriefing provided the last little bit of details that the American government needed to find Roy. Army Special Forces took over the location and rescue operation on the morning of September 7th, 2005. Members of the Army's Delta Force located and freed Roy Hallams. He was dehydrated and malnourished. He lost about 40 pounds in 10 months as a captive. He suffered from severe muscle atrophy and small space-induced nearsightedness over an already natural nearsightedness. The first important thing that he asked for when he went back into U.S. custody was a shower. Apparently it was a half-hour-long shower that he took. He was then interviewed by a psychiatrist before being turned over to 2 FBI agents for his initial debriefing. And before starting the debriefing, he asked for a cigar, a shot of Jack Daniels, and a barbecue sandwich. He didn't really care about General Order Number 1. One of those agents later said that when the psychiatrist prepared him to meet with Roy, the psychiatrist said this guy could be a holy wreck. But Roy really held it together. Obviously, he had some issues, but he was not wailing and crying. He had it together, and he was amazing. Now, Susan, Roy's ex-wife, provided some more context to that and said that Roy was in shutdown mode for months after he got home. He would shake. But he snapped back quickly. He was always a very patient person and laid back. He had a strong will to live, and he was determined to see his family again. Of the 24 Americans that have been taken as contractors or journalists between 2003 and 2011, 11 were killed, 5 remain missing, 1 escaped, and 5 were freed. In 2016, 3 more were captured but freed within a month, and they were the first Americans kidnapped since 2011. Now we're going to go back 63 years to before Roy Hallams was even born, when another major defense contract put civilian contractors in a potential war zone. A group of eight huge construction firms were hired by the government to develop Pacific bases. One of these, Morrison Knudsen, had a reputation for building bridges, roads, and dams all over the world, including the Hoover Dam and the Golden Gate Bridge. They had a contract to build a base on Wake Island. As of December 8, 1941, there were 1,145 contractors and a little over 500 military personnel on Wake Island. For 2 weeks, this group defended the island from Japanese attack before surrendering to an invasion force of over 1,500 Japanese Marines, backed by 3 cruisers, 6 destroyers, and 2 aircraft carriers. The defense was memorialized in the 1942 film Wake Island, and work on that film began before the battle was even over. The filmmakers made 3 different endings. Depending on how the war was going when the film was released, they would use the appropriate ending to tell their story. But out of this battle, a little over 1,100 contractors were taken prisoner, most of them transferred to other camps in the Japanese home islands and elsewhere, including China. 98 contractors were retained on Wake Island to help with the Japanese with continuing to build defenses there for the Japanese. Not unlike Iraq, a host of complex legal problems affected the hundreds of civilian workers that were taken. Japan chose to regard the construction workers as prisoners of war instead of civilian internees, and rebuffed all military, public, and private efforts to have them released. As employees of private contractors, they were protected by workers' compensation laws. The Defense Base Act rose from the issues in World War II. But the contractors weren't obligated to continue paying wages. The workers' individual contracts had been breached by a third party in legal jargon, but Morrison Knudsen continued paying allotment checks into 1942. The Navy, who originally contracted, had no legal responsibility for welfare or wages, and was also expressly prohibited from compensating the families of these civilian POWs by the laws governing military expenditures. In 1943, a partial payment of wages was authorized, and a later law raised the credits to the full wages paid to the civilian employees of the government and dependents. Family members could draw up to 70% of those monthly payments. Like Roy Hallam's family and the Free Roy Foundation, the families formed a Women of Wake organization led by Mary Ward of Los Angeles. The death rate of Western prisoners of war in Japanese POW camps was 27%, 7 times that of POWs under the Germans and Italians. And those 98 contractors left on Wake to work for the Japanese garrison were not among those survivors. In October 1943, the remaining 98 Wake Island contractors were forced to dig a pit and were machine gunned to death. A lone survivor escaped and later carved a message on a coral rock near the mass grave before he was captured and beheaded. After the war, the Japanese commander responsible for the massacre was executed. Each returnee's trip home was a little different. Some arrived on the West Coast via ship and were put up in suites paid for by Morrison Knudsen. Others went into military hospitals to recuperate. More than one went home, got back pay, and, quote, laid around and drank for 2 or 3 months. All of them were extremely malnourished and regained their weight quickly, some gaining back 70 pounds in 3 months. Many of the returnees showed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, frequent nightmares, flashbacks to prison camp, depression, anger. Government studies from the time indicated that while 25% of all veterans suffered from the disorder, almost 90% of ex-POWs suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, including those from Wake Island. There were no support programs. World War II prisoners had to handle the situation on their own and with the support of loved ones. Most former POWs, especially those from the Japanese camps, suffered from heart and liver problems, diminished eyesight, and nervous disorders. But the VA wouldn't pay for treatment until 1980, when full veterans benefits were extended to World War II prisoners of war, including Wake civilian survivors. The film didn't help either, as it told too many people back home a fictionalized version of the truth that didn't come anywhere close to the reality. A total of 66 decorations for bravery went to the Wake defenders, including a posthumous Medal of Honor, 10 Navy Crosses, 6 Silver Stars, 34 Bronze Stars, 4 Air Medals, and 7 Legions of Merit. One of the Navy Crosses went to a civilian physician, Lawton E. Shank. The Morrison Knudsen General Superintendent, Dan Teeters, received a Bronze Star, as did John Peter Sorensen, who received his posthumously. By one account, 24 contractors were recommended for Bronze Stars and 219 for the Medal of Freedom, the 1945 civilian equivalent of the Medal of Honor. So, 2004, 1941, what was the same? What was different? Well, one major difference lies here at the heart of our conference. How did the U.S. government solve its contractor problem in 1941? They formed the construction battalions, the Navy Seabees, very famous, well-known, storied. Admiral Ben Muriel, who was the first Seabee leader and also happened to be the supervisor of the civilian contractors before the war, later said, "It was neither fair to the individuals concerned nor in the interest of overall military efficiency to call upon civilian workers untrained in combat duties and in measures of self-protection to work under enemy fire." The solution then was to move away from civilian contractors. And here we are today talking about civilian contractors. And as Mark Cancian told us yesterday, contractors as force structure are here to stay. Then what, if anything, should we learn from these experiences? What did the defenders of Wake Island tell us? Roy Hallam's return was very similar to what the World War II returnees dealt with. The physical and psychological ailments that Hallam's exhibited upon his return match what many World War II prisoners dealt with: extreme weight loss, isolation, repeated beatings, reduced vision, post-traumatic stress. Who's responsible for tracking a captured PMC? Who provides wages? Do back wages get paid? Who negotiates with the captors? Who deals with the families? Who provides the post-release medical care and counseling? And Molly spoke a lot about some of this. And what's a contractor's legal status? You'd think by now we'd have that one sorted out, and clearly we don't. Does any of it matter? If you've got the FBI and the State Department acting on behalf of the contractor and Delta Force doing the rescue, I end this with questions, and because I believe that this is neither the time nor the place for answers, but these are things that we have to think about. We have to look at them, and as I think Eric Prince pointed out yesterday, maybe writing them into the contract is the way to go. But we do the future a disservice if we do not think of these issues. They've happened before. They are going to happen again. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. It was a great series of presentations, and I think now we're ready to take questions.
Okay, I'm going to start it out then. So you talked about, and this is for our trio, but it could apply to any of them. One of the comments you made was about contributing to state fragility and the impact of countries. In any of your case studies, given the discussions we've had on South Africa and how prevalent the PMSCs are in South Africa, did you look at any specific case studies that dealt with South Africa or anything in that region?
No, we didn't. I'll leave it up to you guys.
I know on the hacking team 400 gigabyte leak that was actually posted in 2013, South Africa was listed as one of the vendors that was receiving an annual maintenance fee supplied to hacking team with their mass surveillance tools. Besides that, there was no actual case study that was prevailing directly towards South Africa.
Do you have any estimate of the unclassified numbers of the Russian hackers that are out there? I mean, is there any idea?
So I'll say that's an incredibly difficult estimate to come to. The nature of force generation within these capabilities is very different than conventional recruitment, conventional training, conventional equipping. In particular, there's a very, we didn't look at this extensively on the discussion because of the nature of the focus, but the role of independent contractors, the role of recruited assets within these structures is incredibly significant. We have seen extensive repurposing of otherwise legitimate security industry folks. We've seen repurposing of underground actors, that is, cyber criminals operating for their own illicit profit purposes within some of the intelligence service run operations in these cases. As a result, if you think about these as transitory capabilities that are assembled as needed for particular operations and campaigns, dissolved and then re-equipped, it begins to give us a better sense of that instrument than, you know, how many battalions hath this hacker, right? I think the recent vision or introspection given by certain DOJ indictments around the GRU offensive units in particular have been very instructive. I think this is the barest tip of the iceberg. We are dealing here in the most formal and organized part of that spectrum with a component that is a national signals intelligence capability, trained and equipped as such at the high end, and across the spectrum of proxy responsibility to a much wider community. So, yeah, hard numbers are not the easy estimate here.
One observation and one question. Sometimes what goes around comes around. Regarding your presentation, sir, if you go back and look at Frederick Forsyth's Dogs of War, I believe it was, talking about mercenaries operating in Africa paid by non-state actors, what goes around comes around. Regarding Russia's work, let's put it that way, has your work and the work of your colleagues, has anybody on the political side of the fence shown any interest in your work and the work done by your colleagues?
Political questions are hard. I will say there is intense and enduring policy interest in how to respond to the changing nature of hostile state offensive capabilities acquisition and their employment. I think you will see that the changing national posture towards addressing some of the sustained intrusion problems particularly when we talk about actions which may be transitive against or directly targeted against national critical infrastructure, is a certain threshold of concern. How we define that critical infrastructure in a number of ways. We define our partner and our allied interests in that space in a number of ways. You will have seen recent public remarks by General Nakasone, Dernsa, and Commander U.S. Cybercom, indicating a change in U.S. posture to defend forward, that is, to act in gray space beyond our networks. I will leave the gentleman's words to speak for himself in that regard, but I will say there has been a robust intellectual effort to explore what that means and how to consider both ways in which we manage that problem, reduce the chances that these incidents may lead to inadvertent escalation, and that we appropriately signal resolve and reach a place and we can argue whether it's possible or not to reach a place in cyber operations where we can restore a deterrent construct or not. But it is the objective. And as to Mr. Forsyth, it's very interesting. He'll be speaking at the Cambridge Intelligence Seminar next week. So yeah, it does come around quite frequently, as we say.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Where would you gentlemen put companies such as Google in the spectrum of your current topic?
Well, with Google, it's a different kind of aspect there when you relate it to it. Because again, we're talking about mass surveillance here and a government aspect there. With these private security companies that I've talked about today, they're more directly marketing towards the government themselves and the entity of itself. But Google supplies their services towards the people. But it's just more of a market relational, like it's just how the government approaches this. Now, again, these companies are directly supplying towards the government and have no interaction with the people whatsoever. They do not privately monitor. These aren't people that are saying, hey, we're monitoring all your citizens. Also, we have their data. Also, do you want to buy it for us? It's more of a just, we have these tools that we're making for you. Here's the tools. Use them however you wish. Now, if the countries use them inadvertently, maliciously or not, it's just not for the company to say. But with Google, though, is again, they have the data, they have the services, and it's the question of whether they should or shouldn't supply these services to the government with all the data that they have on their users. That's all when it relates to the security companies.
I'll pick up on that very quickly. There's a related aspect we did not explore today, but the question of how private intelligence services are delivered to defend networks, to trace and track adversary threats. My presentation draws heavily on industry reporting of this nature. Google does have a new, very important threat intelligence play known as Chronicle, very instrumental in enabling a number of companies throughout the space to operate effectively and to trace adversary action. Again, I'm strictly vendor neutral in my comments, but it is a notable player in the ecosystem. There's a number of similar players out there that provide differing degrees and capabilities of services. I think one of the interesting and thus far underexplored aspects of the space has been the role of these companies, their capabilities in both informing national perspectives as well as potentially delivering new capabilities on their own right. And particularly as we see an emergence of non-Western companies in this space. We've seen very substantial controversy around the role of Kaspersky, for example, based on certain U.S. government pronouncements. But we've also seen emerging Chinese firms offering cyber threat intelligence services and potential capabilities associated with that, as well as some of the other emerging market players. Interesting space, a lot of work there as well.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. Going, gone. Thank you very much.
Give him a hand. We'd like to recognize the audiovisual team here before we break up and go. So Travis and John, if you guys can come up here, and where did Brandon go? Come on up here. So these are the brainchild behind all of the IT and the audiovisual technology and stuff for the conference. It's been a very complex thing for us to do, to live stream, to closed caption, to microphones and everything else, and these guys did a great job at it. And Travis Burdick is really the director here, and the brains behind everything, and John and Brandon were certainly instrumental in doing so. So we did want to make them a little presentation before we take off here.
So what we do, for those who help us out a lot, I got to tell you, these folks did an outstanding job. They captured all the stuff on video. They helped with the live streaming for Evelyn's presentation. They've been absolutely magnificent. So this is a little bit of Dunigan gold for them. It's not real gold. But it has both of the seals of the university, the steeple that you see out here on one, and then the Corps Cadets distinctive unit insignia on the other. Thanks, sir. I'm not going to take the cloth off. That's okay. Thank you so much. Thanks. And I do have Kirsten. Kirsten works for the University Press. She's been in overwatch of all the books, sat there patiently and listened to all the different presentations. And thank you for your help as well.
All right, come on up here, Brent. So Brent Chen is the director of the Convocation Center here, and we just want to recognize him because of all the activity and work that he and his guys put together for this facility as well. Okay, and Dr. Pfaff, closing remarks.
You've heard it before. I'll say it again. What a great conference, and I think it's not out of line for one more round of applause to all the conference organizers. Because this was really a very impressive gathering of wide variety of experts and expertise on a range of issues that come to bear on probably what's one of the most complicated things, at least from a government and policy perspective, we actually have to solve if we're going to move forward to the challenges and handle the challenges that we have been discussing for the last day and a half. And I think the total sum of information presented here gave us a much better, I know for myself, a better and nuanced understanding of how private military companies operate, what their concerns are, what their challenges are, and what conditions lead to success and which ones lead to failure or at least undermine effectiveness, and suggestions for how we can address that. We took on the question straight on of how much government should rely on contractors, whether support to military operations or should they be allowed to conduct military operations on behalf of the government. And I think we all thoroughly enjoyed and got a lot out of our relatively spirited discussion yesterday on the legal challenges associated with broadening the role of military contractors. And so that leads me to the next group I would like to thank, which is you guys. The questions were fantastic. The interaction both during the panels and presentations as well as on the margins was, I thought, exceptional. So a round of applause for you guys who put in a lot of effort to be here and absorb the information and be informed. And like any good conference, that leaves you wanting more, right? We didn't answer all the questions. And there were a lot raised that bear further research. Addressing the regulatory challenges is one. Proper care and integration of contractors into society. What does the society owe people who take on these risks and hardship? What are the barriers to state, PMC, effective state and military contractor cooperation? How do we overcome them? And then finally, as we move forward and address all these challenges, what are the best and worst practices associated with contractor employment? And I'm sure there's others, and I look forward to, particularly your researchers who write on this, what you're going to say as a result or after this conference, and what gets out in there and increases the body of knowledge that we have on this, which will eventually help our government, if not others, to solve what is really a tricky problem. So on that cheerful note, am I allowed to declare the conference closed? The conference is closed. Thank you very much.